There are moments in life that split everything into before and after. One breath, you're just a man doing a job, and the next, you're standing between someone else's life and the worst night of theirs. Ethan Cross never looked for those moments. He'd had enough of them overseas, in places whose names he wasn't allowed to say out loud. But when he heard the scream outside the Meridian Grand Hotel, short, sharp, cut off too fast, his body moved before his mind gave permission. Some training doesn't leave you. Some of it becomes the marrow of who you are. Like this channel and comment your city below. Let's see how far this story travels. The night was the kind of humid that made Houston feel like it was breathing on you. Ethan had been parked in the rideshare queue for 40 minutes, engine idling, the AC working harder than it should have been for a 4-year-old Camry with 112,000 miles on the odometer. He had the radio on low, some sports talk station he wasn't really listening to, and a half-eaten granola bar on the center console that he kept meaning to finish and kept forgetting about. His phone showed 11:47 p.m. He had one more hour before he'd call it a night. That was the deal he'd made with himself 3 months ago when he'd started driving for Ride. One more hour past midnight, then home. Because Marcus went to bed late enough as it was, and even at 7 years old, the kid had some kind of internal radar that woke him up the moment Ethan's key touched the front lock. And then there'd be 20 minutes of Dad, "Can we watch one more thing?" And Ethan would say no, and Marcus would give him that face, the one that looked so much like Claire's that it physically hurt sometimes. And Ethan would end up sitting on the edge of the kid's bed, watching half an episode of whatever cartoon was trending until Marcus finally went back to sleep. It was a good problem to have. He was thinking about that, about Marcus and the cartoon and the granola bar, when the scream cut through everything. It wasn't long. That was the thing people got wrong about screams like that. They imagined something from a movie, sustained, operatic. This was 1/2 second of sound, a woman's voice, high and surprised and abruptly silenced. It came from the far end of the hotel's side entrance, where the decorative hedges threw shadows the parking lot lights couldn't reach. Ethan was out of the car before he'd consciously decided to move. He didn't run. Running made noise. He moved fast and low along the edge of the lot, using the parked cars as cover, and within 4 seconds he had eyes on what was happening. A man in a dark hoodie had a woman pinned against the stone wall beside the service entrance. One hand at her throat, not choking, controlling. The other hand pressed something against her ribs that caught the light wrong, the dull non-reflection of matte black metal. He was talking to her in a low, urgent hiss, and she was trying to comply, her fingers fumbling at the clasp of the structured bag over her shoulder. She was in a suit, hair pulled back. The bag was the kind that cost more than Ethan's monthly car payment. The robber was maybe 6 feet, broad through the shoulders, weight distributed forward. Nervous. His head kept jerking toward the parking lot entrance, which told Ethan 2 things immediately. He was alone, and he was operating on a timeline he was worried about blowing. Ethan closed the remaining distance in 3 seconds, came in from the man's right, the gun side, the dangerous side. And the robber didn't hear him until Ethan's left hand closed over his gun hand, thumb driving hard into the web of flesh between index finger and thumb, forcing the weapon down and away while his right arm came around the man's throat from behind. The gun discharged into the pavement. The crack of it was enormous in the enclosed space. Ethan felt the woman flinch, heard her gasp. He didn't look at her. He kept his focus on the man who was reacting now with the frantic strength of someone who understood he was losing, twisting, throwing an elbow back that caught Ethan in the ribs, not hard enough to matter. "Drop it," Ethan said. His voice was flat. It was the voice he'd used in Fallujah and Kandahar and a shipping container outside of Djibouti. The voice that communicated without any room for misunderstanding that the person using it had already decided how this ended. The man didn't drop it immediately. They never did. But 30 seconds later, with his wrist bent at an angle that was 4 degrees from fracture, the gun hit the ground. Ethan swept it away with his foot, kept the man controlled against the wall, and finally let himself look at the woman. She was standing with her back against the stone, both hands pressed flat against it like she needed the solidity. Her breathing was fast and shallow, but her eyes were clear, not in shock, processing. "You hurt?" Ethan asked. She shook her head once. "Your phone. Call 911. She already had it out. The robber tried once more, a sudden lunge, trying to use his height to break Ethan's grip. and Ethan put him on the ground with a technique that wasn't anything you'd see in a gym. His knee in the man's back, the man's arm locked out above him. "Stop moving," Ethan said, "and this doesn't get worse for you." The man stopped moving. By the time the police arrived 6 minutes later, Ethan was crouched against the wall of the hotel, elbows on his knees, watching the robber sit with his wrists zip-tied with the woman's laptop charging cable and his chin down and his evening thoroughly ruined. The woman, who'd given him her name as Victoria, no last name yet, was standing 6 feet away, back straight, answering a uniformed officer's questions with a precision that suggested she'd spent a lot of time in rooms where saying the exact right thing was the difference between good outcomes and bad ones. She kept glancing at Ethan. He looked away every time. His name went into 3 separate police reports that night. The officers were professional about it, asked good questions, were clearly trying to figure out who exactly this rideshare driver was, who disarmed a man with a firearm using nothing but his hands, and apparently the ambient confidence of a man who'd done considerably more dangerous things before breakfast. Ethan answered everything they asked and nothing they didn't. Retired military? Yes. Special operations? Yes. He'd prefer not to be more specific. No, he didn't know the woman. No, he didn't know the attacker. Yes, he was available for follow-up questions. They took his number. He took his copy of the incident report. He drove home. It was 1:20 a.m. when he pulled into the driveway of the small house on Aldine Street that he rented month to month. The lights were off. He sat in the car for a moment with the engine ticking and the granola bar still on the console and thought about the weight of that man against the pavement and the sound of a gun going off 3 inches from his right hand. Then he went inside and stood in the doorway of Marcus's room for 2 minutes, watching his son sleep. Marcus slept the way kids sleep when they're genuinely safe. Completely, unreservedly, one arm hanging off the edge of the mattress, and his mouth slightly open and a stuffed German shepherd named Captain wedged under his chin. The nightlight cast everything in a pale blue that made the room look like the bottom of a swimming pool. Ethan fixed the blanket that had migrated south, picked up the water cup from the floor, and went to his own room. He didn't sleep for a while. He'd been 22 when he joined the Navy, 24 when he got through BUDS, which was the hardest thing he'd ever done up to that point, and which recalibrated his understanding of what hard meant so thoroughly that he'd never used the word the same way since. 7 years as a SEAL. 4 combat deployments, 2 commendations he never talked about. A left shoulder that ached in cold weather because of an incident in a mountain pass in eastern Afghanistan that he also never talked about. He'd met Claire at a wedding, his teammate Dario's sister's wedding, specifically, which he'd attended under protest because he'd just gotten back from 8 months overseas, and the last thing he wanted was an open bar and a DJ playing September by Earth, Wind and Fire. Claire had been there because she'd been the bride's roommate in college. She'd been wearing a yellow dress that she later told him she hated, and she'd been standing alone at the edge of the reception hall looking at her phone with an expression of pure dignified boredom that he'd found, for reasons he still couldn't fully explain, absolutely arresting. He'd walked over. He'd said something stupid. "You look like you're calculating how long you have to stay before you can leave without seeming rude." And she'd looked up from her phone and said, without missing a beat, 42 more minutes. I've already said goodbye to the bride. They were married 14 months later. Marcus came 2 years after that. And everything was not perfect. Ethan had never trusted perfect. But it was good. Real. The kind of life that felt like it had weight to it. Substance. Then Claire got sick. She was 31. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday in November, and Ethan remembered that day with a granularity he couldn't apply to most of his combat experiences. The texture of the waiting room chairs. The doctor's tie, which was burgundy with small geometric shapes. The sound Claire made, not crying, not right away, just this brief exhale, like someone had pressed gently on her chest. Glioblastoma. The aggressive kind, which was almost all of them, but hers was particularly so. Ethan was midway through a deployment cycle when it happened. He requested compassionate reassignment. The Navy was good about it, actually, better than he'd expected, which made it harder somehow because there was no bureaucratic wall to be angry at. He came home. He became her primary caregiver. He held things together with the discipline that was the only thing Bud/S had reliably given him. the ability to function under conditions that would have stopped him before. She died 22 months after the diagnosis, on a Wednesday morning in September, with Ethan holding her hand and Marcus asleep in the next room. Marcus was 4. Ethan was 29. He hadn't gone back to active service. There was no version of that math that worked. A 4-year-old who'd just lost his mother and a deployment schedule that took you off the continent for 8 months at a stretch. He'd separated honorably. He'd moved to Houston, where Claire's mother lived, because Marcus needed family nearby and because Houston was somewhere he'd never been stationed and therefore wasn't crowded with ghosts. He drove for ride because it paid adequately and the hours were flexible around Marcus's school schedule. He did contract security consulting for a firm downtown, 3 days a week, which helped. It wasn't the life he'd imagined, but he'd stopped measuring his life against imagined versions of it somewhere around the 2nd year after Claire's death. He was 32. He had a son who was obsessed with German shepherds and animated movies about robots. He had a house with a leaky faucet in the second bathroom that he kept meaning to fix. He had the mornings when Marcus ate cereal with the wrong milk-to-cereal ratio and narrated his dreams with elaborate detail and inaccurate geography. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything, actually, but Ethan wasn't the kind of man who said things like that out loud. Well, he didn't expect to hear from Victoria Sterling. He'd looked her up the next morning. Habit, protocol, something you did when you'd had physical contact with a stranger in a charged situation, and found more than he'd expected. Victoria Sterling, CEO and founder of Sterling Capital Group, ranked 44th on a list of most powerful women in American finance, subject of a Forbes profile from 18 months ago that he'd skimmed and found was largely about how she'd built the firm from a single client and a rented office with secondhand furniture into a $500 million investment management company by the time she was 27. There was a photo with the article, business attire, conference table, the kind of headshot that was trying to project authority and succeeding. But her eyes were looking slightly past the camera, not at it. And Ethan had the impression of someone who'd gotten very good at performing a version of herself and was, in the photo, perhaps a half-second from dropping it. He thought that was interesting. Then he thought he was projecting. Then he forgot about it because Marcus had a school thing that afternoon and the car needed an oil change. Her assistant called him at 2:15 p.m. Not Victoria. Her assistant, a very efficient-sounding young man named Derek, who explained that Ms. Sterling would very much like to express her gratitude in person, at a dinner of his choosing, at his earliest convenience, and that Ms. Boaz. Sterling was aware this was an unusual request and had asked Derek to emphasize that she completely understood if he preferred not to. Ethan said he'd think about it. He thought about it for approximately 45 minutes, which he spent changing Marcus's school-mandated book report from bullet points back into actual paragraphs, and then called Derek back and said yes, he'd come to dinner. He didn't analyze the decision too hard. He'd learned that a certain amount of not analyzing was good for his mental health. The restaurant was called Laurel, and it was the kind of place where the menus didn't have prices, which Ethan had always considered an aggressive social move but chose not to take personally. Victoria was already there when he arrived. She was in a navy blazer and a white shirt with the top button undone, her hair down this time rather than pulled back, and she stood up when he came to the table with the slightly formal energy of someone who was used to being the most prepared person in any room and was currently recalibrating because she wasn't sure what category to put him in. "Mr. Cross," she said, extending her hand. "Ethan," he said. He shook it. She had a firm handshake. He noticed she clocked that he noticed. "Victoria." A brief pause. "Or Ms. Sterling, if you're more comfortable. I was told you're former military, and I know some people prefer—" "Ethan's fine," he said. "Victoria's fine." They sat. The silence lasted about 4 seconds, which was a comfortable silence for him, and apparently not for her. "I want to apologize," she said. "That's actually the first thing I wanted to say, and I've been rearranging the order since you walked in." "Apologize for what?" I had a full speech prepared about gratitude and resourcefulness and the fact that you almost certainly saved my life, and then you walked in and you looked like someone who would find a speech like that unbearable, and I've been trying to figure out how to condense it to something that doesn't make your eyes glaze over." Ethan looked at her for a moment. "How'd you know I'd find it unbearable?" "I didn't. That's the apology. I made an assumption." He considered this. It's not a bad assumption. Something shifted at the corners of her mouth. I know. The waiter came. They ordered drinks. Ethan, coffee, Victoria, sparkling water, which he noticed and didn't comment on. The menus arrived. The menus were genuinely without prices. Ethan ordered the salmon because it was the thing he would have ordered if he'd known how much it cost, and he figured that was the honest approach. Can I ask you something? Victoria said once the waiter had gone. Sure. When you came around the corner last night, did you hesitate at all? He thought about that honestly. No. Not even for a second? No. She looked at him in a way that he could feel was professional assessment, not personal, not yet. Why? Hesitation is trained out of you, he said, or it gets trained into a different kind of hesitation. You learn to hesitate before the situation, to gather information. But in the situation, you don't hesitate. You act on what you've already assessed. I assessed fast. What did you assess? That he was alone and nervous, that the gun was his comfort item, not a plan. He was holding it like a threat, not like someone who intended to use it. That you were cooperating, which meant you were thinking clearly, which meant you wouldn't do something unpredictable. He paused. That the angle gave me an approach that could neutralize the weapon hand before he registered contact. Victoria looked at him steadily. You assessed all of that in maybe 2 seconds. A brief silence. What happened to you? She asked. Not unkindly. The directness of it actually landed better than anything softer would have. I mean that I'm not trying to be intrusive. I mean, how does someone develop that? So he told her. Not everything, not the detailed version, but the honest version. The Navy, the SEAL teams, the deployments. She listened the way people listened when they were genuinely paying attention rather than waiting for their turn to speak, and he appreciated that enough to be more honest than he'd planned. He didn't plan to mention Claire. He mentioned Claire. It came out sideways, the way it usually did. He was explaining why he'd separated from service, and you couldn't explain that without explaining what had happened to Claire, and then he was explaining Claire, and he watched Victoria's face move through something that was more than polite sympathy and hadn't been calibrated for the table. I'm sorry, she said, and it was the plainest version of those 2 words, no performance in them. It was 3 years ago, he said, which was not the same as it's fine, but was the only thing he had. How old is your son? 7, Marcus. He took out his phone. He never used to be the kind of man who showed phone photos at dinner, and then Marcus existed, and showed her a picture that Marcus had taken himself, which meant it was slightly blurry and shot from below, and captured Ethan in the middle of making a completely undignified face while flipping pancakes. Victoria looked at it for a moment. He looks like you. He looks like his mother. Both, maybe, she said, handing the phone back. There was a gentleness in how she said it that wasn't careful or practiced. It was just the truth delivered without the padding people usually wrapped it in. Ethan put the phone away. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes? The Forbes article. The secondhand furniture in the first office. Was that true, or is that the version that makes a better story? She stared at him. Then she laughed. Genuinely, not the social laugh she'd probably deployed 1,000 times in conference rooms. It was shorter and less polished, and it changed her face considerably. Both, she said. There was genuinely secondhand furniture. I also knew it would make a better story. That's a more interesting answer than either one alone. I know, she said. That's why I tell it that way. Chat. He found out about her childhood the way you find out about a lot of things over dinner, sideways, through the gaps between deliberate things she said. She'd grown up in Beaumont, 90 miles east of Houston. Her father had left when she was 6. Her mother had worked 2 jobs through most of her childhood. Victoria had been the kind of kid who did homework in the break room of a Denny's at 11 p.m. while waiting for her mother's shift to end. Full scholarship to UT Austin, finance degree. She'd worked at a wealth management firm for 3 years and had spent most of those 3 years being underestimated in ways she was now articulate enough about that Ethan could tell she'd spent real time examining them. The senior partner called me young lady in front of a client once, she said. I was 25, he was 63. The client was 61. I'd prepared the entire analysis for the meeting. They were discussing it over my head, literally, and calling me young lady. What did you do? I interrupted the senior partner mid-sentence and corrected an error in his risk analysis that would have cost the client $200,000, she said, politely, with a smile. And then I excused myself to get coffee that no one had asked for because I knew if I stayed in the room I was going to say something I couldn't take back. Did the senior partner thank you for the correction? The look she gave him answered that question thoroughly. I started the firm 8 months later, she said, with one client who believed in me and $60,000 that I'd saved for 4 years, and a small business loan that I had to apply for 3 times because the first 2 lenders decided I didn't look like someone they should give money to. What does that look like? Someone they should give money to? Older, she said, and different in ways that aren't worth itemizing. She said it plainly, without performance or anger, the way you talk about things that are true and exhausting and no longer worth being surprised by. Ethan nodded. He understood the particular frustration of having demonstrated capability and still having to prove it again to every new room. The firm is doing well, he said. Not a question. Very. A pause, and then something slightly more honest beneath the professional assurance. Better than I let myself believe it would be when I was calculating my runway in a rented office with a leaky radiator. Better than the second-hand furniture, she smiled. Significantly. What? It was after dessert, which he'd had and she hadn't, but had watched him eat with a combination of curiosity and restraint that he found telling in some way he couldn't immediately articulate, that she brought it up. I'd like to offer you a position, she said. Just like that. No runway into it. Ethan set down his coffee cup. Head of corporate security at Sterling Capital, she said. The current security structure is handled through a contract firm, and it's, she chose the word carefully, adequate. I'd like something more than adequate. I'd like someone who understands threat assessment as a discipline, not just as a checklist. You don't know me, Ethan said. I've had 18 hours since last night, she said. I know more than you'd think. She said it without apology. Your service record is partially public. Your contract work with Hargreaves Security has clients who talk. You have a reputation for being thorough and being honest, including about things that are inconvenient. You also didn't charge me for the emotional labor of having a trauma response in front of you, which is, a brief, dry pause, rarer than it should be. That last one's not a security credential. No, she agreed. It's a character credential. I found those matter more in the long run. He looked at her. She looked back. She had the quality, he thought, of someone who had survived enough disappointment to no longer be afraid of it. She was making this offer knowing he might say no, and had structured herself against the possibility. Why not use a firm, he asked. A dedicated corporate security firm? Because a firm has other clients, she said. I want someone whose primary responsibility is this company, who understands the assets, the risks, the personnel. A pause. Who I can trust. The word trust landed differently than she'd perhaps intended it to, and he could see her register that. I'm a rideshare driver, he said. You were a Navy SEAL for 7 years, she said. You're a rideshare driver for the same reason people become rideshare drivers. Logistics and economics. That's not an indictment of you. It's an indictment of a system that doesn't adequately value what you have. She stopped, and he could see her recalibrating. That was more editorial than I intended. It was accurate, he said. I know, she said. That doesn't mean you wanted to hear it. He sat with it for a minute. The restaurant had thinned out around them. Someone at the bar was laughing at something, and it was too loud and then it stopped. What does it pay? He asked. She told him. He was quiet for a moment. That's 4 times what I make between Ride and Hargreave combined, he said. Yes, she said. That's calculated. Of course it is, she said. I'm not trying to be clever about it. I want you to be able to say yes without the money being a barrier. And I want you to know exactly what you're worth so you're not wondering if I'm lowballing you. You researched my current income. I researched your current income, she confirmed, and had the grace not to look apologetic about it. Ethan pushed back from the table slightly, just a few inches, the physical equivalent of, I need a moment. He thought about Marcus and the school schedule and the leaky faucet and the granola bar and the house on Aldine Street. He thought about the 6 years of training and experience that had been sitting in a car picking up strangers from airports. I'd want a trial period, he said. 90 days. I assess the current setup, the risks, the gaps. I give you a full security analysis. At the end of 90 days, we evaluate whether this is working. Agreed. And I need flexibility for my son's schedule. School pickups, medical appointments, anything that involves him takes priority. She didn't hesitate. Agreed. And if I see something in your operation that concerns me, about protocols, about personnel, about anything, I tell you directly, and I expect you to listen. Not agree with me necessarily, but actually listen. That's the only version of this that makes sense to me, she said. If I wanted someone to tell me everything was fine, I'd keep the contract firm. He nodded slowly. I'll need the weekend to think about it, he said. Take the weekend, she said. Take longer if you need it. He looked at her across the table. She was watching him with something that wasn't quite patience. Patience was passive, and there was nothing passive about her, but was the controlled stillness of someone who'd learned that the hardest outcomes were often the ones worth waiting for. Okay, he said. I'll be in touch Monday. Well, he thought about it the whole drive home. He thought about it while he paid the sitter, a retired school teacher named Mrs. Galvin, who lived 3 houses down, and whose hobby was apparently competitive jigsaw puzzles based on the evidence. And while he checked on Marcus, who had migrated entirely to the wrong end of his bed and was sleeping with his feet on his pillow. He thought about it while he stood at the kitchen counter, eating the other half of the granola bar and staring at nothing. The money was real. The opportunity was real. The woman was... He caught himself. The woman was his potential employer, which was a complete sentence that required no additions. He put the wrapper in the recycling. He went to bed. He lay in the dark and thought about a second-hand furniture office, and a scholarship student doing homework in a Denny's at 11 p.m., and a senior partner who'd called a 25-year-old woman young lady while she was quietly catching his mistakes. He thought about his shoulder, which ached in a way it hadn't ached in a year. He thought, protecting the right things. That's what you were trained for. He called Derek on Monday morning and said yes. His first day at Sterling Capital, he wore the one suit he owned, which he'd bought for Claire's funeral and had dry cleaned twice since, and which was slightly too formal for what turned out to be a largely open-plan tech-forward office full of people in their 20s and 30s who dressed with the calculated casualness of people who had decided that looking like they didn't care was itself a form of caring. Victoria met him in the lobby. She was in a gray suit, her hair back, and she was on her phone, talking to someone in the brief, efficient sentences of a person who was managing 17 things and allotting this conversation about 4% of her attention. She looked up when he came through the glass doors and held up one finger. Give me 30 seconds. And he waited, looking around the lobby. It was good space, clean lines. A security desk that was staffed by a man named Reggie, who was perhaps 60 and reading a magazine with an attention to it that suggested the magazine was more interesting than his post. 2 cameras visible above the desk, angled wrong. A door to the left that was propped open with a wedge that someone had clearly put there for convenience and left. Ethan noted all of this. Victoria ended her call. Sorry, welcome. I know it's a lot at once. It's fine, he said. Before the tour. That door. He nodded toward the propped door. She looked. It should be closed, he said. That's a staff-only corridor, I'm assuming. Propped door is a tailgating vulnerability. A brief pause. She looked at Reggie. Reggie, without being asked, got up and pulled the wedge out. Day 1, Victoria said quietly. Something dry and not unkind in it. Day 1, Ethan agreed. She showed him around. The offices, the server rooms, the executive floor where her own office occupied a corner with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of downtown Houston that cost something Ethan preferred not to calculate. She introduced him to people, the operations director, the CFO, the head of IT, and he shook hands and said the right things and cataloged everything. At the end of the tour, she showed him his office, which was on the executive floor, adjacent to her assistant's space. It was a good office, more than he'd expected. There's a desk in here, he said. Generally considered standard, Victoria said. Most security operations are on the ground floor. Most corporate security is reactive, she said. I want yours to be proactive. That means proximity to where decisions are made. He looked at her. I need to brief you on the threat landscape daily, she said. Having you 4 floors down makes that harder. You plan this out. I plan most things out, she said, not apologetically. Is the office a problem? He looked around. The desk was good. The sightlines were good. There was a window, which he'd have preferred not to have, but the glass was laminated. He could see the layering in the corner, which meant it was blast resistant, which meant someone with more foresight than the average facilities manager had been involved at some point. No, he said. It's not a problem. He sat down at the desk. On his first day at Sterling Capital, in a suit that belonged to the worst year of his life, in an office he hadn't expected, with a view of a city that had never quite felt like his, Ethan Cross set a fresh legal pad on the desk, uncapped a pen, and wrote at the top of the first page, "Current gaps. Start with the door." It was a start. It was, he would realize later, the start of considerably more than he'd bargained for. Outside, the city moved through its ordinary Tuesday. Cars and noise and people who had no idea that somewhere in the chain of events that had led Ethan Cross to this desk, a man in a dark hoodie had made a choice that would rearrange everything, not just for Ethan, for both of them. The door in the lobby was closed now. There were others that weren't. The legal pad filled up faster than he'd expected. By the end of his first week at Sterling Capital, Ethan had covered 14 pages with notes, observations, and questions. Mostly questions, because the more he looked at the company's current security posture, the more he found things that weren't wrong exactly, but weren't right either. The contract firm that had been handling corporate security for the past 2 years had done the work of people who understood security as a concept rather than as a practice. The cameras were positioned for the appearance of surveillance, not the function of it. The access card system had 3 separate tiers that were supposed to be distinct and weren't, because someone had granted blanket level 2 access to the entire marketing department 18 months ago, and nobody had audited it since. The server room had a biometric lock on the front door and a ventilation panel in the back that a determined 12-year-old could have removed with a flathead screwdriver. He wrote it all down. He didn't editorialize, he just documented. On Friday afternoon, Victoria called him into her office for what she described as a week 1 check-in, which turned out to mean she sat on the small sofa in the corner rather than behind her desk, a deliberate choice, he noted, that flattened the hierarchy, and said, "Tell me what you found." He told her. He went through it methodically, without softening any of it, because she'd specifically said she wanted someone who'd be direct, and the fastest way to erode that kind of trust was to start varnishing things on day 4. The camera angles, the access card issue, the server room. A reception protocol that was friendly and efficient and would have allowed almost anyone to reach the executive floor with a confident stride and a plausible excuse. She listened without interrupting, which he'd already identified as one of her operating principles. She had a coffee cup in both hands that she didn't drink from during the whole briefing. "How bad is it?" she asked when he finished. "It's not a crisis," he said. "It's accumulated negligence. The difference is that accumulated negligence can become a crisis on a specific Tuesday when the wrong person notices the same gaps I noticed. How long to fix it? The physical stuff? Cameras, server room panel, access audit? 4 weeks if I have cooperation from IT and facilities. The protocol stuff is ongoing. You can't fix culture in 4 weeks." She nodded slowly. "You'll have cooperation from IT and facilities." "I'll need it in writing," he said. "Not because I don't trust your word, because when I walk into someone's department and tell them their procedures need to change, they need to know the request isn't coming just from me." "I'll send an email to both department heads this afternoon," she said, "with you copied." "Thank you." A brief pause. "You said accumulated negligence," she said, "not incompetence." "No," he agreed. "Incompetence implies intent to fail." The contract firm did what contract firms do. They checked boxes efficiently and moved on. That's not a character flaw. It's a structural limitation of the model. Victoria looked at him with that assessment quality he'd clocked at dinner. "You're precise about the way you describe things." "It matters," he said. "If you mislabel the problem, you design the wrong solution." She set down the coffee cup. "I've had people in advisory roles before who spent the first month telling me what I wanted to hear. I found it significantly less useful than this." I'm not in an advisory role, he said. No, she agreed. You're not. He picked up the legal pad. I'll have a formal written assessment to you by Wednesday. Priority items flagged separately from the secondary list. Good, she said, and then in a slightly different register, less CEO and more person. How are you settling in? The question caught him slightly sideways, which was probably her intention. Fine. It's a different pace than I'm used to. Different how? Quieter, he said. More variables. Combat environments are high intensity, but the variables are finite. You know who the threat is, usually. Corporate environment, the variables are, he paused, finding the word, diffuse. That bothers you? Not anymore, he said. I've been doing contract security consulting for 2 years. You learn to sit with diffuse. A beat. It's just different. She nodded. He had the impression she understood what he meant more precisely than he'd said it, which was both useful and slightly disconcerting. How's your son? She asked. Good. He has a science fair project due in 3 weeks and has decided his project will involve testing whether different brands of crackers get soggy at different rates in the same soup. I've been advised that this is serious science. Victoria made a sound that was almost a laugh. Is it replicable? He ran the first trial twice, Ethan said, with slightly different soup temperatures, so arguably, yes. That's a controlled variable, she said. That's good experimental design. I'll tell him you said so. He'll want it put in the written assessment. This time she did laugh, and then seemed to catch herself and recalibrated to something more professional, and Ethan thought that was interesting. The moment of laughter, and then the correction of it, like she'd learned somewhere that warmth was a thing to ration. He didn't comment on it. He picked up his legal pad, said he'd have the written assessment by Wednesday, and went back to his office. He sat down and looked at page 15 of the legal pad for a long moment. Then he wrote, access to exec floor too easy for someone with confident affect and minimal documentation. And then, after a moment, including me, first day. He underlined the second line. Marcus declared the cracker experiment a success on Sunday morning, by which standard success meant that he'd filled 3 pages of a composition notebook with handwritten data, spilled soup on the kitchen table twice, and determined that one brand of oyster cracker maintained structural integrity for 40% longer than the others, which he considered a major scientific discovery. It's a real finding, Ethan said, cleaning up the second soup spill with the methodical patience of a man who had navigated worse. Don't discount it just because it's crackers. My teacher said, I need a hypothesis, Marcus said, very seriously. I had a hypothesis. My hypothesis was that all crackers are the same. And? And they're not, Marcus said. I was wrong. That's okay, though, because Mr. Park says being wrong is how you learn. A pause, during which he ate an intact oyster cracker with an expression of scientific objectivity. Dad, do you ever get your hypotheses wrong? Ethan thought about this. More than I get them right. What do you do? Update the hypothesis, Ethan said, and look at what you missed. Marcus considered this. What did you miss? Different things at different times, Ethan said. He poured Marcus more orange juice. You going to put that in your report? What? That you were wrong. Most people leave that part out. Marcus looked at him. He had Claire's eyes, exact same shade, the dark brown that went almost amber at the edges in direct light. Should I put it in? Yeah, Ethan said. That's the most important part. Marcus wrote it down. Ethan watched him write and felt the thing he sometimes felt on Sunday mornings that had no precise name. Not grief exactly, not anymore, more like the awareness of an absence that had become its own kind of presence. He thought, she would have loved the cracker experiment. He thought, she would have suggested adding a 4th soup temperature. He made more coffee and didn't say any of this out loud. The written assessment reached Victoria's desk at 7:45 a.m. on Wednesday, 45 minutes before their scheduled meeting, because he wanted her to have time to read it first so the meeting could be about decisions rather than absorption. She arrived at the meeting having clearly read it. There were notes in the margin of her printed copy, in a handwriting that was small and precise and underlined things in straight lines. They went through it in order. She asked good questions, and they were genuine questions, not the kind that were actually positions dressed up as questions. She pushed back on his recommendation to replace the contract firm entirely. The firm had relationships with current staff, she said, and relationships were infrastructure too. And he adjusted the recommendation to a phased transition that kept the firm in a support capacity while internal protocols were rebuilt. "This is better than the original," he said, about the adjusted version. "We both thought of it," she said, which was either generosity or accuracy, and he wasn't sure which. He decided it was accuracy. On his way out of her office, she said, without looking up from the assessment, "The Cracker report. Did he put in that he was wrong?" Ethan stopped in the doorway. "He did." "Good," she said, still not looking up. "That's the most important part." He went back to his office and did not think about that particular exchange any more than was necessary. The weeks developed a structure. He was at the office by 7:30, which put him there before most of the staff and let him walk the floor without the friction of people going about their mornings. He liked the building in that window. The cleaning crew finishing up, the security desk Reggie hadn't arrived to yet, the hum of servers from the room he'd already secured properly with an actual lock on the ventilation panel. He'd catch things in those early minutes that he'd miss later in the day's noise. The camera system was replaced in the third week. He'd worked with the IT director, a sharp, slightly skeptical woman named Priya, who'd warmed to him incrementally once she understood he wasn't going to pretend to understand her domain better than she did. On the new positioning, which gave real coverage of the lobby, the stairwells, and the loading dock that had been previously entirely blind. The access card audit took longer because it required cross-referencing two separate HR databases that had been maintained in parallel and not merged, which Priya described as a legacy decision that made someone's life easier in 2019 and everyone's life harder since. He'd spent 4 evenings that week at the kitchen table after Marcus went to bed, going through the spreadsheet Priya had pulled, flagging anomalies with the focused tedium that was a different kind of discipline from combat but required the same basic equipment, attention and patience, and the willingness not to stop when you got tired. Marcus, who had a 7-year-old's complete indifference to boundaries, wandered out at 9 p.m. one of those evenings and said, "Dad, what are you doing?" "Access audit," Ethan said. Marcus looked at the spreadsheet. "That's a lot of names." "It is." "Are they bad guys?" "No," Ethan said. "Most of them just have access to things they shouldn't anymore. Like if you had a key to a house you used to live in." Marcus thought about this. "You should ask for the keys back." "That's essentially what I'm doing," Ethan said. "Go back to bed." Marcus went back to bed, paused in the hallway, and said, "Dad, do you like your new job?" Ethan looked up from the spreadsheet. "Yeah," he said. "I think I do." "Is your boss nice?" He thought about that for a moment. Yeah, she's good at what she does." "Is she like your friend?" "She's my employer," Ethan said. Marcus made the face that meant he was filing this away for future reference. "Okay," he said, and went to bed. Ethan went back to the spreadsheet. The friendship, if it was that, developed in the margins of the professional. It wasn't anything he'd planned, and he didn't think she had either. That was maybe what was most notable about it, that it wasn't a managed thing. Victoria didn't manage warmth well. She could perform it. He'd seen her do that in client meetings, where she'd be charming and accessible in a way that was real enough to be convincing, but had a slight intentionality behind it, the way an actor inhabits a role they know well. But the unmanaged version, the one that slipped out in the gaps, was different. She started stopping by his office, not for scheduled things, just a comment on something she'd read, a question about the security assessment that could have been an email and wasn't. Once, a takeout container of something she'd ordered that turned out to be more food than she could eat, left on his desk with a post-it that said simply Thai in her small, precise handwriting. He ate it while reviewing vendor contracts and thought it was one of the better things he'd eaten in recent memory, which said something about his current relationship with food. He stopped by her office too, eventually. Not often. But when something came up that required judgment about whether the response was proportionate, a client who'd made a security team member uncomfortable, a vendor access request that had minor red flags, he found himself preferring a direct conversation to an email because her read on people was sharp and different from his, and the combination produced better answers. "You're not what I expected," she said one afternoon in her office, 3 weeks in. She said it the way she said most things, directly, without a lot of introduction. "What did you expect?" "Someone more," she searched for it, "operational. Someone who led with the SEAL thing." "Some guys do," he said. "It's not a template." "No," she agreed. "You lead with the quiet." He considered this. "Is that a criticism?" "No," she said. "It took me about a week to understand that the quiet was paying attention." A beat. Most people are quiet because they don't have anything to say. You're quiet because you're already 3 steps ahead. "Sometimes 2 steps," he said. "Modest. Accurate." She smiled, the real one, the one that was shorter and less polished. He'd learned to track for it without tracking for it, the way you learn to monitor something in your peripheral vision. He became, in that period, quietly aware of certain things. That she ate irregularly, skipping lunch often, then ordering too much at dinner because her blood sugar was low and her judgment about portions was affected. That she had a habit, when she was stressed, of rotating a ring on her right hand that he eventually realized was a small signet ring with a worn design he couldn't make out. That she'd arrive some mornings with an energy that was slightly too controlled, the kind that came from having managed something difficult before 7 a.m., a call with an investor, a board issue, something, and wouldn't mention it unless he asked directly. He didn't ask directly most of the time. He wasn't sure that was his place. He also became, during those weeks, aware of Marcus noticing things. Marcus was 7 and possessed the social antennae of someone who'd had to read rooms from an early age. The rooms of a house where a parent was sick, then gone, then grieved. He noticed that Ethan got dressed more carefully now. He noticed that Ethan came home more satisfied, in a way that had been absent for a while. And he asked, one Saturday while they were at the park, and Captain the stuffed dog was wedged under his arm, and he was watching the ducks with the focused attention of a natural scientist, "Dad, is your boss pretty?" Ethan kept his eyes on the ducks. "That's not a relevant professional assessment. But is she?" "She's—" He stopped. "That's not the kind of question you ask about someone's employer." "You didn't say no," Marcus said, with the devastating logic of a 7-year-old. Ethan took the stuffed dog and gave it back to him upright. "How are the ducks?" Marcus looked at the ducks. "The brown one's in charge," he said after a moment. "You can tell." They watched the ducks for a while. Mampas. It was at the 5-week mark that the first threat arrived. He wouldn't know until later how significant it was. At the time, it presented itself as a nuisance. An anonymous email to Sterling Capital's general inbox that contained a vague warning about consequences and what happens to people who take what isn't theirs. The language was non-specific enough that the initial read was disgruntled client or random crank, the kind of thing that corporate inboxes collected with some regularity. He didn't treat it that way. He pulled the email's metadata, forwarded it to his contact at HPD's cybercrime unit, and cross-referenced the language with the client complaint file that the operations team kept. He asked IT to check whether similar language had appeared in any prior communication, emails, contact forms, anything, in the past 18 months. Priya came back to him 3 hours later looking like someone who'd found something and wasn't happy about it. She sat down across from his desk and put her laptop in front of him. There were 4 prior emails, different addresses, each one created and apparently abandoned, sent at irregular intervals over 8 months. None of them had been flagged. They'd landed in the general inbox and been treated as noise. He sat with this for a long moment. "Anyone else seen these?" he asked. "I pulled them myself," Priya said. "Just me. Keep it that way for now." He looked at the emails. "Can you get me IP origin data?" "Already working on it. Probably bounced, but I'll trace as far back as I can." He looked at the 4 prior emails. They were vague in the same way the new one was vague. No specific threat, no specific demand, just that quality of language that wanted to communicate that someone was watching without saying precisely what they were watching for. That quality was not the quality of a random crank. Random cranks broadcast. Whoever had sent these 4 emails over 8 months had been pacing themselves. He sat in his office for 20 minutes after Priya left and thought about the robbery outside the Meridian Grand. The timing of it. How it had looked. A straightforward robbery. interrupted by circumstance. He thought about Victoria, who was 4 offices down, currently on a client call, probably rotating the signet ring on her right hand. He thought, what if the robbery wasn't straightforward? He didn't go to her with it. Not yet. He didn't go to anyone with a hypothesis that was currently just a shape, no evidence, no chain, just a sense that the picture on the wall was slightly off level and no one had stood back far enough to notice. He went home, cooked dinner, helped Marcus practice the cracker experiment write-up, and thought about the emails while he was doing both of those things, in the part of his mind that never really stopped running. He briefed Victoria the next morning after Priya had gotten back to him with partial IP data that confirmed what he'd already suspected. The emails were routed through a chain of proxies that would take forensic specialists time to peel back, but had enough signature consistency to suggest they were from the same origin point. He put the printed emails on her desk. 5 of them, chronological. She looked at them for a long time. Her face didn't change much. He watched for the ring rotation and saw it. 3 small turns, unconscious. I didn't know about the first 4, she said. They went to the general inbox. They were probably screened out as noise. Were they noise? No, he said. Someone's been running a slow pattern here. 8 months of low-level contact, none of it specific enough to escalate. And then last night's is slightly different. He pointed to the most recent email. The language tightened. What isn't theirs is more specific than the previous ones. Someone's focusing. She sat back. Do you have current litigation? He asked. Anything that would create a disgruntled party at the level of sustained harassment? We settled a dispute with a former client 8 months ago, she said slowly. Damages claim. It didn't go their way. How didn't it go their way? They alleged we mismanaged a significant position in their portfolio. The arbitration found in our favor. They lost, she paused, substantially. Name? She hesitated, and he understood the hesitation. This was still in the realm of hypothesis, and naming someone was a step that felt different from looking at anonymous emails. I need the name, Victoria. She said it. Hartwell. Connor Hartwell. He ran Hartwell Capital before the arbitration. Afterwards, she chose her words carefully. He doesn't run Hartwell Capital anymore. Ethan wrote it down. This might be nothing to do with him, he said. The timing could be coincidental. But you don't think it is? He looked at her. I think coincidental timing requires more evidence than I currently have. I'm not drawing conclusions. I'm collecting information. That's the diplomatic version, she said. What's the direct version? He picked up his notepad. 8 months of anonymous emails that began within weeks of a major adverse arbitration outcome, followed by an incident outside this building that I'm no longer sure was random. That's a pattern I'd want to understand better before I was comfortable calling it coincidence. She was quiet for a moment. The robbery, she said. Possibly. You think someone sent that man? I think it's a question I can't answer yet with the information I have, he said. I'm going to need access to everything you have on the Hartwell arbitration, and I'm going to need to talk to HPD about the robbery case. She nodded. He looked at her. She was managing it well. The composure was real, not performed. She was processing the information and organizing her response to it. But beneath the composure, he could see the particular quality of someone recalculating safety in a space they'd thought was safe. We're going to change your personal security protocol, he said. Starting today. I'll walk you through it. I have a car service, she said. I know. We're going to add to it. Nothing visible, nothing disruptive to your daily schedule. Just additional points of contact and awareness. A beat. I'd rather have the protocol and not need it than need it and not have it, she finished. Yeah. She turned her chair slightly, looking out the window at the Houston skyline, the mid-morning light coming in at an angle that made everything look warmer than it probably was. I'm not someone who gets scared, she said, and it didn't sound like bravado. It sounded like someone taking an accurate inventory of themselves. I've had clients try to intimidate me before. I've had investors pull funding to make a point. I've had a lot of things. I know how to manage threat. I know, he said. But this is different. Yeah, he said. It is. She turned back from the window. The composure was back in full. Whatever had briefly surfaced underneath it resolved back into function. "Tell me what I need to do," she said. He told her. He picked Marcus up from school that afternoon at 3:15, and Marcus got into the car with the specific energy of someone who'd had a social development. "Dad," Marcus said, buckling himself in with the three-buckle process that he insisted on doing himself and which took slightly longer than strictly necessary. "Jalen said his mom picks him up in a car with a driver." "A car with a driver," Ethan said, pulling out of the pickup line. "Like, she doesn't drive it. Someone else drives it." "That's a car service," Ethan said. "Oh." Marcus considered this. "Does your boss have a car service?" Ethan glanced in the rearview mirror. "Why do you ask?" "I'm just asking," Marcus said, with the studied casualness of a 7-year-old who had a specific direction they were going. "She does," Ethan said. Marcus nodded. "Is she rich?" "That's not a polite question about someone's employer." "But is she?" "Successful," Ethan said. "She built something from nothing. That's different from just being rich." Marcus thought about this with apparent seriousness. "Like how you built your soup testing thing when you were in the—" He searched for the word, "the Navy." "That's—" Ethan paused. "Not exactly the same, but the principle is similar." "Are you going to tell her about my crackers?" "I already mentioned the experiment." Marcus's head came up fast. "What did she say?" "She said your controlled variable was good experimental design." Marcus absorbed this. "She sounds smart." "She is," Ethan said. "She's very smart." They drove in silence for 2 minutes, which with Marcus was usually a countdown. "Dad?" Marcus said. "Marcus? Is she nice to you?" Ethan watched the road. The afternoon traffic was building on the 610, the kind of low-grade gridlock that Houston specialized in. "Yeah," he said. "She is." Marcus seemed satisfied with this. He looked out the window at the passing cars, Captain wedged against his ribs, and said nothing else for the rest of the drive. Ethan drove and thought about the 5 emails in chronological order, and Connor Hartwell, and the robbery, and the specific angle of an amateur who'd sent a man to do something but hadn't accounted for a retired Navy SEAL being in the rideshare queue. He thought, whoever this is, they're not done. He thought, I need to be faster than they are. He thought about Marcus's question, "Is she nice to you?" and the way he'd answered it without hesitating. He turned off the highway and didn't think about that last part anymore. Not yet. The file on Connor Hartwell was thicker than Ethan expected. He'd requested it through Victoria's legal team on a Thursday, and by Friday afternoon it was on his desk. Physical copies, because he preferred reading on paper when he was trying to understand the shape of something, the way a map tells you more when you can trace it with your finger than when you're scrolling across a screen. 3 inches of arbitration documents, financial records, correspondence, and a 40-page summary prepared by Sterling Capital's outside counsel that read like a clinical autopsy of a business relationship gone catastrophically wrong. He read it over the weekend. Marcus was at Claire's mother's house for Saturday, a standing arrangement that gave Ethan 1 full day per week to be something other than a father, which he'd initially resisted and now quietly depended on. He sat at the kitchen table with the file and a pot of coffee that he worked through in a way that was probably not ideal for his cardiovascular system, and he read. Connor Hartwell had been, by all documentary evidence, a genuinely successful fund manager for about 12 years. Hartwell Capital had grown from a small family office serving Texas oil money into a mid-tier investment firm with roughly $2 billion in assets under management, which was not Sterling Capital's scale, but was real. Hartwell was 61. He'd been in finance for 4 decades. He'd had a reputation, across the documents, as someone who was aggressive but competent, the kind of operator who pushed limits but understood where the walls were. And then 3 years ago, he'd made a play for a mid-sized pharmaceutical company called Veritas Pharma, targeting its acquisition at a moment when Veritas was undervalued due to a regulatory delay on its flagship drug. The play required a consortium of co-investors. Hartwell had approached Sterling Capital. Victoria had done her due diligence and declined. Her written assessment, included in the file, was 2 pages long and precise in its reasoning, citing regulatory risk, timeline uncertainty, and what she described as an acquisition structure that front-loads risk onto co-investors while insulating the primary orchestrator. She'd declined professionally and in writing, and the decline had been accepted on the surface as a business decision. Hartwell had proceeded without her. He'd assembled a different consortium, closed the acquisition, and then the regulatory delay on the Veritas drug had extended by 14 months while the acquisition debt accrued. When the drug finally cleared, at a reduced approval that cut its market projection by 30%, the consortium had lost a combined $400 million. Hartwell's personal exposure was estimated at $80 million. Hartwell Capital, leveraged for the play, had been unable to survive the loss. He blamed Victoria, not privately. The arbitration file contained communications in which Hartwell alleged, through counsel, that Victoria Sterling had possessed proprietary intelligence about the Veritas regulatory timeline. Inside information, essentially, that she had used to protect herself while allowing him to proceed into a trap. The allegation was unsubstantiated. The arbitration panel had found no evidence of impropriety. Victoria's decision to decline had been documented, reasoned, and based on publicly available analysis. Hartwell had lost. The panel had awarded him nothing. The final document in the file was a letter from Hartwell's attorney, dated 2 months after the arbitration ruling, addressed to Victoria directly. It was professionally worded and said very little explicitly, but the sentence that Ethan read 3 times was near the end. My client intends to pursue all available remedies and to ensure that the full circumstances of this matter receive the public scrutiny they deserve. He set the letter down. He picked up his phone and called his HPD contact, Detective Reyes from the cybercrime unit, who'd been working the email trace. "How far back have you gotten?" Ethan asked. 3 proxy layers, Reyes said. "Working on the 4th. Whoever set this up knew what they were doing, but they didn't know it perfectly. There's a timing signature in the send intervals that's consistent enough that we can probably use it for comparison if we get another sample." "You'll get another sample," Ethan said. He was looking at the letter. "The robbery outside the Meridian Grand 2 months ago. Is that still open?" A pause. "The rideshare driver case? That's yours?" "I was the rideshare driver," Ethan said. Another pause, different quality. "Huh. Has the suspect talked?" "Some. He's got a public defender and an incentive to minimize, so we're getting the version of events that's most useful to him. He maintains it was opportunistic, saw a woman alone, saw the bag." Reyes paused, but his phone showed a text message from an unregistered number 40 minutes before the incident. The text had the hotel name in it. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Can you share that number?" "I can share it with an official request. Give me a day." He hung up and sat with the file for a long time. The shape of it was clearer now, but clarity wasn't comfort. What he had was a man with motive, 8 months of low-grade harassment, and a circumstantial connection to an attempted robbery that may not have been about the bag at all. What he didn't have was enough for an arrest, a restraining order, or anything more than an elevated threat assessment. What he had mostly was the certainty that this wasn't finished. He called Victoria. She picked up on the second ring, which told him she'd been awake and probably working, which was a Saturday and which he filed without comment. "Tell me what's in the file," she said. He told her. He went through it carefully, the same way he'd briefed her on the security gaps in week 1, directly, without editorializing, letting the facts carry their own weight. He heard her breathing change slightly when he got to the part about Hartwell's letter, the line about public scrutiny, and didn't slow down or soften it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "He thinks I knew," she said. "He still thinks I knew about the Veritas timeline." "Apparently." "I didn't," she said. "I declined because the deal structure was bad. Everything I needed to know was in the public filings, if you read them carefully enough." He didn't read them carefully enough. A pause, and something complicated moved through her voice. "He lost everything, and he needed it to be someone's fault." "That's probably accurate," Ethan said. "That doesn't make it less dangerous." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't. People who need someone to blame are more motivated than people who want something specific. They don't have a threshold." She absorbed this. "What do we do?" she asked. "I'm coordinating with HPD. I want the phone number from the robbery case matched against any numbers in Hartwell's documented communications." That's going to take time and legal process. He looked at the file. In the meantime, I want to increase the personal security detail. I want to put a second person on your morning and evening commute. Not visible, not a car following you, just someone at each endpoint who's aware and in communication with me. That's, she started, and he heard the resistance forming. I know, he said. It feels like a lot. It feels like I'm being watched. You're already being watched, he said quietly. I'm asking you to let me watch back. A long pause. Okay, she said. But I want daily briefings, not summaries sent through Derek. I want you to tell me directly. Agreed. And if something changes, if the threat level changes, you tell me immediately, not after you've processed it and decided what I can handle. He heard that sentence clearly. I wasn't going to do that. Men do that, she said. Decide what women can handle. I want your word that you won't. He thought about the arbitration file. The way the opposing counsel's documents had consistently referred to her as Ms. Sterling's company in a construction that was technically accurate and meaningfully diminishing. The way even the panel's ruling, which had been entirely in her favor, had a tone of faint surprise about it. You have my word, he said. Another pause, different in quality from the earlier ones, less calculating and more something else. I hate this, she said. Not dramatically, just stating a fact. I know. I built this company to be a place where I controlled the terms, she said. And now some man who made bad decisions is trying to... She stopped. I know that's not useful to focus on right now. It's useful to feel, Ethan said. Just not useful to only feel. A brief silence. That's an interesting distinction, she said. It's the one that kept me functional for the first year after Claire died, he said, and then wasn't sure why he'd said it, because it was more personal than the conversation had been. She didn't turn it into more than it was. She just said quietly, I'll see you Monday, and hung up. He sat with the phone in his hand and the file on the table in the quiet of a house with no one else in it, and thought about all the things that were moving in the dark, gathering speed. Monday brought the second direct incident. He arrived at 7:30 to find Reggie at the security desk looking like a man who had already had a difficult morning. On the desk in front of him was a padded envelope, opened, its contents removed and placed in an evidence bag by the time Ethan got there, because Reggie, despite his magazine-reading tendencies, had had enough sense to call building security and not touch it further. The contents were a photograph. It was Victoria, shot from a distance, telephoto lens, in the parking structure adjacent to the building. She was walking toward the elevator bank, bag over one shoulder, looking at her phone. The timestamp in the corner of the photo was from the previous Wednesday. On the back of the photograph in block letters, what she took from me. Ethan looked at it for a long moment. Reggie said, I didn't open it on purpose. The outside just said Sterling Capital, urgent, and I. It's okay, Ethan said. You did the right thing calling building security. Don't touch anything else. I need the building's exterior camera footage from this morning, specifically the mail delivery window. He called HPD, he called Priya. And then, before Victoria arrived, he went to her office, sat down in one of the chairs that faced her desk, and waited. She came in at 8:10, coffee in hand, and stopped when she saw him. She read his face accurately. People who'd managed significant things for significant amounts of time learned to read the difference between routine and not routine in the faces of people who reported to them. She sat down. He told her about the envelope. He described the photograph. He watched her absorb it the same way she absorbed most difficult information, face-controlled, processing underneath. He was in the parking structure, she said. Or someone he hired was, Ethan said. Last Wednesday, which means active surveillance, not just emails. She set her coffee down. He escalated. Yes. Her hand went to the ring on her right hand. 3 rotations. I need to see it, she said. Victoria. I need to see the photograph, she said, in a tone that was not asking. He took her to the security office where the evidence bag was logged, and she looked at the photograph through the bag for about 30 seconds, and he watched her look at it. At the image of herself unaware, caught in a moment of ordinary movement, turned into something else by the fact of the camera, and the man who'd sent what the camera caught. She handed it back without comment. In the hallway outside the security office, she stopped walking and stood with her back against the wall for a moment, and he stood beside her and didn't say anything, because sometimes what people needed was someone to stand there and not fill the silence with management. After about 15 seconds, she said, "I'm angry. That makes sense." "I'm not scared," she said. "I want to be clear about that." "I know. But I'm angry." She pushed off the wall. "Tell me what happens now," he told her. The HPD case was now elevated from potential harassment to credible stalking. Detective Reyes was fast-tracking the phone number cross-reference. The building was going to add a security presence in the parking structure. He was personally going to adjust her morning arrival protocol. She'd call him when she left home, and he'd be in the lobby when she arrived, every day until this was resolved. "You'd be in the lobby at 8 in the morning," she said. "I'm here at 7:30 anyway." "You don't need to Victoria," he said. "I'm going to be in the lobby." She looked at him. "Okay," she said. He was in the lobby every morning after that. But the company noticed in the way companies notice things, through the slow accumulation of observed details and the conversations that happened between floors and around coffee machines. The new camera system had been noticeable. The changed access protocols had been noticeable. The head of corporate security standing in the lobby every morning when the CEO arrived was, in a different register, also noticeable. People were professional about it, mostly. The CFO, a measured man named Gerald, who'd been with the company since its second year and had a talent for saying precisely what needed to be said and nothing more, stopped Ethan in the hallway one afternoon and said, "I take it there's an elevated situation." "There's a situation we're managing," Ethan said. "I won't ask for specifics," Gerald said. "I'll just say that the staff are observant, and they're going to notice if things feel tense at the top. So if there's a way to keep the visible security presence calibrated—" "I'm aware," Ethan said. "I'm trying to make the necessary adjustments without creating an atmosphere that affects how people work." Gerald looked at him with the assessment quality of someone who'd watched a lot of people come through executive roles. "You're good at this." "I'm trying to be," Ethan said. "There's a difference," Gerald said, "between being good at something and trying to be good at something. You're the first one." He walked on and left Ethan with that observation, which was more pointed than it sounded. Priya, who communicated entirely in direct statements, stopped by his office and said, "I pulled something you should see." She'd been digging into the email IP chain independently in the hours she apparently had between running the IT department for a 100-person financial firm, and she'd found a thread that Reyes's team had also found but hadn't had time to fully develop. The proxy chain on the emails eventually pointed to a server cluster registered to a shell company in Delaware that had been active for 11 months. The shell company's registered agent was a law firm in Atlanta, and the law firm in Atlanta, after 3 more layers of search that Priya had done with a focused tedium that he recognized and respected, had a corporate client list that included a company called Meridian Advisory Services, which had Connor Hartwell listed as a senior consultant. It wasn't direct evidence. There were too many layers and too many plausible deniabilities for it to be direct evidence. But it was a thread, and it connected in the right direction. "This is good work," he told Priya. "I know," she said, without false modesty. "I'm going to keep pulling." "Tell me before you pull anything that might alert the other end," he said. "We want to keep the thread intact." She nodded and left, and Ethan called Reyes and walked him through what Priya had found. And Reyes made the sound of someone who'd just gotten something they'd been waiting for. "That's enough to get a warrant for the Atlanta firm's client records," Reyes said, "which means we can potentially tie Hartwell to the shell company directly." "How long?" "Judge I want for this warrant is back from vacation Thursday," Reyes said. "Call it end of next week for the records if the firm cooperates. Longer if they stall." "If they stall, who do we escalate to?" "FBI, if the wire communications cross state lines, which they do." "I've already been in conversation with the field office." A beat. "Your guy was careful, but not careful enough. The photograph was a mistake." "Why?" "Because it's physical evidence that required physical presence," Reyes said. "Emails are deniable. A photograph hand-delivered to a specific address means someone was here, in Houston, in that parking structure. That narrows the field considerably. After he hung up, Ethan sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. He thought about the word careful, about a man who'd spent 8 months sending untraceable emails and then sent a photograph, about what changes between those two choices. What emotion overrides the discipline that kept you safe? He thought, he's getting frustrated. Frustrated people make mistakes. He thought, frustrated people also escalate. He went to find Victoria. She was in a client meeting that ran long, and he waited outside the conference room in a chair that had probably been selected by a designer and was aesthetically appropriate and completely uncomfortable. And he went through the case timeline on his phone and found 3 things he wanted to verify. She came out of the conference room at 5:15, the last of the clients still talking to her, a man who laughed too loud and stood slightly too close, and she handled it with the exact calibration of someone who'd been handling it for a decade. Present, warm, professionally conclusive. And then the man left and she turned to Ethan, and her face did the thing he'd come to recognize, the shift out of the performed version and into the direct one. "Walk with me," she said. He walked with her back to her office. Her assistant was packing up for the day. She waved Derek off and closed the door herself. "Reyes is moving on the warrant," Ethan said. "End of next week, possibly sooner." "What does that mean practically?" "Potentially enough for an arrest if the records show what we think they'll show." He paused. "In the meantime, I want to talk about an additional measure." She sat on the edge of her desk rather than behind it. "What measure?" "I want to put a secondary security presence at your home," he said. "Not inside. I know that's not something you'd want, but in the vicinity, someone who can be there in under 90 seconds. She looked at him. "You think he knows where I live?" "If he had someone in the parking structure, he may have followed you home at some point," Ethan said. "I don't want to assume he didn't." She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her working through what it meant. The parking structure photograph, the hotel robbery, all of it suddenly mapped onto the geography of her daily life, the route from her building to her front door. "I don't like this," she said. "I know. I grew up in a house where I had to pay attention to everything," she said, "where every day had an unpredictable element. I spent 20 years building something so I wouldn't have to live that way." She looked at her hands. The ring rotated. "And now, it's temporary," he said. "We're close to having enough to end it." "You don't know that." "No," he said. "I don't know it for certain, but the pattern suggests we're close." He's escalating because the emails weren't getting results. Escalation means impatience. Impatience means mistakes. She looked up. "Reyes said that. About the photograph." "It's a sound read." "And if he makes another mistake before you have the warrant?" Ethan met her eyes. "That's why I want someone near your building." She turned the ring twice more. "Who would you put there?" "There's a former HPD officer named Salazar who I've worked with through Hargreaves Security. She's good and she's discreet." She? He paused. "Is that relevant?" "No," Victoria said. "I was just... No, it's fine." A brief pause. "Set it up." "I will." He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. "Go home. Eat something. And I mean a meal, not whatever's left in that drawer you think I don't know about." She stared at him. "What drawer?" "The one in your desk with the protein bar wrappers and the half-eaten sleeve of crackers." He said it without emphasis. "You skip lunch, and then you eat that at 3 in the afternoon and call it nutrition." A pause. "That's a privacy violation." "The drawer was open when I walked in last Tuesday," he said. "I have eyes." She looked at him for a moment, and then something happened to her expression that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite something else either, and she shook her head in a way that was probably meant to be dismissive and wasn't entirely. "Good night, Ethan," she said. "Good night." He left. He didn't see the moment clearly until later being 3 weeks after, when he could look back at the individual components and understand how they'd accumulated. In the middle of it, it presented itself as a case he was working and a professional relationship with someone who was occasionally more honest with him than most people were, and a daily schedule that had developed its own rhythms the way things do when they have structure and repetition. He saw her every morning in the lobby. He briefed her at the end of each day. He adjusted the security protocol twice more as new information came in. He kept Marcus's school schedule and the science fair and Mrs. Galvin's jigsaw puzzles and Sunday mornings in their separate lane. But somewhere in there, the lanes had gotten less separate. He wasn't sure when it had happened precisely. Maybe the Saturday phone call, when he'd mentioned Claire without planning to. Maybe the lobby mornings, where the exchange had gradually expanded from anything overnight and nothing overnight to actual conversation, 5 or 10 minutes before the building filled up, when she was in the low-guard state of someone who hadn't yet deployed the professional version of themselves. She talked differently in those mornings, faster, less structured. She once spent 8 minutes describing a frustrating phone call with a board member and used 3 words he'd never heard her use in the office, and he'd found the whole thing unexpectedly funny, and she'd noticed him finding it funny and laughed at herself, which was its own kind of thing. Maybe it was just time. Time had a way of doing this, not dissolving walls, but showing you that the walls had doors you hadn't noticed. What he knew, clearly, was that it was not something he could let become more than it was. She was his employer. She was in an active threat situation and was accordingly dependent on his judgment and his presence in a way that distorted normal assessment. He'd worked enough high-stakes protective details, even in his contract years, to know that proximity and intensity created feelings that weren't always what they appeared to be. He was clear on this. He'd been clear on it, and then Marcus met her. It was an accident in the way that the most significant things usually were. He'd had a scheduling collision. His regular backup for Marcus pickups, Mrs. Galvin, had a family thing that ran long, and the friend who was his second backup had a flat tire on the 610, and Ethan had a meeting with Reyes and the FBI field agent that could not move because the Atlanta firm's records had come in, and there was new information that needed to be processed in person. He'd called Victoria's assistant. He'd explained the situation. He'd said he needed 30 minutes and asked whether there was anywhere in the building that was appropriate for a 7-year-old to sit quietly. He had not expected Victoria to say, through Derek, that she'd pick up Marcus herself. He'd called her directly because that was not what he'd meant, and he wanted to be clear about that. "I have a driver," she said. "The school is 12 minutes from here. Derek has the address you have on file." "Victoria, you don't need to—" "Ethan." Her voice was patient in the particular way it got when she'd already made a decision and was now waiting for the other party to catch up. "You've been here every morning for 3 weeks. Let me do something useful." He thought about arguing. He thought about the 7 separate reasons this was crossing a line. He said, "He'll want to talk the whole ride." "I can manage conversation," she said dryly, and hung up. Marcus arrived in her company car 45 minutes later, which was 20 minutes longer than the 12-minute estimate, and Ethan, who'd finished the FBI meeting and was standing in the lobby when the car pulled up, could hear Marcus through the closed car door before it opened. And the thing about the oyster crackers is that the structural integrity is actually in the rim, not the center, which is why the center gets soggy first. And I think that's because the door opened. Marcus climbed out, still talking mid-sentence, and then saw Ethan and stopped. "Dad," he said, "did you know that Victoria has a car with a driver and the seats are really soft?" Ethan looked at Victoria, who was stepping out of the car behind Marcus with an expression that was the most unguarded he'd seen on her, something between amusement and something warmer than amusement. "I had the full cracker analysis," she said. "Rim structural integrity and all." "I told you," Marcus said to Ethan, with the tone of someone whose scientific findings had been vindicated by a new peer. "You told me," Ethan said. Marcus looked at Victoria with the direct assessment that children applied to new adults. "You're nice," he decided. Victoria looked at him. Something crossed her face that was quick and complicated, and she said simply, "Thank you." "Dad said you're smart," Marcus said. "He said you built something from nothing." "He said that?" "He said it's different from just being rich," Marcus said, with complete 7-year-old earnestness. "I think that's good." Victoria looked at Ethan over Marcus's head. Her expression was not performing anything. It was just open. More open than he'd seen it before. "It is good," she said. "I think so too." Marcus reached out and took her hand briefly, the way kids did, an unreserved, unanalyzed gesture of acceptance, and said, "Can you come see my cracker experiment? I still have the data." She looked at the small hand in hers. She looked at Ethan. He gave her no guidance because he had none to give. "Yeah," she said to Marcus. "I'd like that." They were in his office, Marcus explaining the soup temperature variables with the aid of the composition notebook, when Reyes called. He stepped into the hallway to take it. "The Atlanta records," Reyes said. "We've got a direct payment trail from Hartwell to Meridian Advisory, which we can now tie definitively to the email server cluster. We've also got phone records that put a number registered to a Meridian consultant in contact with the cell phone of the man who committed the robbery. Twice. In the 48 hours before the incident." Ethan stood in the hallway and felt something settle into place that had been unsettled for weeks. "That connects the robbery," he said. "It does," Reyes said. "It was never about the bag. He wanted what was in the laptop. The bag was secondary, probably corporate data. Client files, maybe. Something he could use against the company publicly." "The arbitration," Ethan said. "He wanted ammunition." "That's my read. The FBI field agent concurs. We're moving to the arrest phase." "When?" "We're coordinating with the DA's office now. We want a clean chain on every piece of evidence. Realistically, 72 hours before we're in position." Ethan looked through the office window. Victoria was leaning over Marcus's composition notebook, pointing at something, asking him a question. Marcus was answering with the full-body engagement of a child explaining something important. Victoria was listening with the particular quality she had, fully, the kind that wasn't waiting for her turn. 72 hours, Ethan said. "I'll keep the current protocols in place until I hear from you." "There's one more thing," Reyes said. "Tell me." "The consultant Hartwell used, the one who made contact with the robbery suspect, he's still local, still active, which means he's still potentially operational." Ethan turned away from the office window. "You think Hartwell might accelerate before the arrest," Ethan said. "If he has any indication we're closing in, yes. Desperate people make desperate moves," Ethan said. "Keep her close," Reyes said. 72 hours. Ethan hung up. He stood in the hallway for a moment, recalibrating. 72 hours was manageable. The protocols were in place. Salazar was near Victoria's building. He could tighten the daytime coverage, add checkpoints, keep the footprint small enough not to alarm the office. He could do this. He looked through the window again. Marcus was showing Victoria something on his phone now, probably the blurry, self-taken photograph, and Victoria was looking at it with an expression that was the real one. The short, unlaundered laugh, both hands wrapped around Marcus's small shoulders to see the screen better. Ethan Cross, who had survived 7 years of combat, 4 deployments, the loss of his wife, 3 years of starting over, and 1 very complicated rideshare queue outside the Meridian Grand Hotel, stood in the hallway of a building he was responsible for protecting and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific and slightly terrifying sensation of having more to lose than he'd accounted for. He went back inside. "Reyes?" Victoria asked, reading him accurately. "We're moving to the arrest phase," he said. 72 hours. She looked at him. The open expression from the parking lot had recalibrated back toward professional, but not all the way. There was still something in it that wasn't fully buttoned up. "Is it over?" she asked. "Almost," he said. Marcus looked between them with the attentiveness of a child who understood more than he was supposed to. "Almost means not yet," Marcus said. "That's right," Ethan said. "Not yet." He sat down next to his son, looked at the cracker data, and kept the other half of his attention exactly where it needed to be. The 72 hours did not go cleanly. They rarely did, in Ethan's experience. Clean timelines existed in briefings and planning documents, and the optimistic projections of people who hadn't spent enough time watching things go sideways. Real timelines had friction, legal delays, evidentiary gaps, the particular slowness of institutional processes that moved at the speed of caution while threat moved at the speed of desperation. The DA's office needed an additional review. 48 hours became 60. 60 became 80. Reyes called him at hour 71 to say the arrest warrant was drafted and reviewed and in the hands of the judge, and that they were looking at the following morning, and Ethan thanked him and hung up and recalibrated the next 12 hours in his head. He'd tightened everything he could tighten without making Victoria's daily life unworkable. Salazar was at the building by 6:30 each morning before Victoria's car arrived. He'd added a second camera in the parking structure that fed directly to his phone. He'd changed Victoria's arrival route twice, varying it enough that a surveillance pattern couldn't settle. Victoria had cooperated with all of it without complaint, which was its own kind of notable because she was not someone who cooperated without complaint by default. She'd ask good questions about each change, not resistance, genuine questions, understanding the reasoning, and then implemented each protocol with the precise efficiency of someone who treated security as she treated everything else she decided to take seriously. The office had settled into a different kind of normal. The staff knew something was ongoing without knowing the specifics, which meant they were alternately hyper-aware and performatively casual, depending on their individual temperament. Gerald had implemented a quiet, informal protocol of his own. He made sure there was always someone at the reception desk, always two people in the lobby at once, without being asked and without making a production of it. Ethan noticed and was grateful and didn't say so, because Gerald wasn't the kind of man who needed to be thanked for doing the right thing. Priya had kept digging. At hour 68, she'd found something. She knocked on his office door at 4 p.m. and sat down with her laptop open and her expression carefully neutral, which meant she'd found something and hadn't decided how alarmed to be. "Meridian Advisory Services," she said. "The shell company." "What about it?" "It's registered in Delaware, but it has a Houston mailing address." She turned the laptop toward him. "Commercial mail service, one of those places that takes packages and has 50 companies listed at the same street number. Standard shell setup." She pointed at the screen. "But the secondary contact on the registration is a name, not the law firm this time. A person. Marcus Delray." Ethan looked at the name. "Who's Delray?" "Former employee of Hartwell Capital," Priya said. "He was operations director there until the firm went under. After the collapse, he dropped off the professional radar. No LinkedIn, no new employment listings, nothing. But I ran his name through a couple of public databases and found a lease agreement for commercial office space in the Galleria area, signed 8 months ago." 8 months. The same month the emails started. "He's local," Ethan said. "He's local and he's presumably operational," Priya said. "He's the one who set up the infrastructure. He's probably the one who managed the contact with the robbery suspect." He thought about what Reyes had said. The consultant is still active. He pulled out his phone and called Reyes. "Delray," Ethan said when Reyes picked up. "Marcus Delray, former Hartwell Capital." A pause. "How'd you get that?" "My IT director." He said it with the appropriate fraction of pride. "Is this name in your records?" "He's on our list," Reyes said. "He's in the warrant. We're picking up both of them tomorrow morning." "Both simultaneously?" "Hartwell's in Houston. He flew in 2 days ago. We've been tracking him since he landed. We didn't want to move early and spook Delray." Ethan stood up from his desk. "Hartwell is physically in Houston." "Yes." "And you've been tracking him for 2 days. Ethan, where is he right now?" A brief pause that told him what he needed to know before Reyes said anything. "We lost him 3 hours ago," Reyes said. "He made a stop at a restaurant in Midtown and his surveillance team lost the vehicle in traffic. We're working on relocating him." Ethan was already moving. 3 hours, he said. "Why am I only hearing this now?" "Because we're relocating him and I didn't want to—" "Reyes." His voice was flat, combat flat. "You have a subject with documented history of escalating behavior who is in an active threat situation against my principal, and you lost him 3 hours ago, and you didn't call me. We expected to have him reacquired within— I'm going to need you to accelerate the warrant," Ethan said. "I don't care what the judge's schedule looks like. 3 hours unaccounted for on a subject whose demonstrated willingness to hire people to get at her is not something I can manage from the inside of an 80-hour wait." He was already dialing Salazar on the other line before he'd finished the sentence. "Salazar," he said when she picked up. "Current status." "I'm at the building," Salazar said. "Miss Sterling is on 14, hasn't moved in the last 2 hours. Her car is in the parking structure, driver on standby." "Stay where you are. Do not let her leave the building without me present. I need—" He checked his watch. 20 minutes. He went to his desk, pulled his jacket, clipped the compact radio to his belt that he'd started carrying 3 weeks ago and which the staff had noticed and not commented on. He paused at the door. Priya was still sitting there. "What do you need from me?" "Can you pull the Galleria office space address from the lease agreement?" She already had it on the screen. She read it to him. He wrote it in his phone. Send everything you have on Delray to Detective Reyes at HPD Cybercrime, he said. His contact is in the security directory. Already pulling the email, she said. He went to find Victoria Betishi Ichipat. She was in a meeting. Of course she was in a meeting. He knocked twice and opened the door without waiting, which was something he'd never done before, and which caused 3 people around the conference table to look up with varying degrees of alarm, and caused Victoria to look up with no alarm at all, which told him she'd been expecting something like this for 80 hours and had been running on that low hum of anticipation the whole time. Excuse me, Ethan said to the room in a tone that was apologetic in form and not in substance. Victoria, I need 5 minutes. She was up from the table in 2 seconds. Clean exit. She pulled the conference room door closed behind her. In the hallway, he told her quickly. Hartwell in Houston. Surveillance lost 3 hours ago. Warrant moving faster now. She listened. Her face did not change in the ways that fear usually changed faces. No blanching, no widened eyes. Her jaw set, and the ring rotated, and her breathing was measured and deliberate. You're moving me, she said. I want you somewhere that isn't this building until Reyes has both of them in custody, he said. You have a place outside the city? Family. Anything the public record doesn't have connected to you? She thought for 2 seconds. My attorney has a lake house in Conroe. He's offered it before. I've never used it. Does Hartwell know about it? He'd have no way to, she said. I've never been there. It's not in my name. Call your attorney, he said. Ask permission and get the address. Don't use your regular phone. Use this. He handed her the secondary phone he'd been carrying as a backup. This number isn't connected to your name or your accounts. Don't call Derek. Don't call your driver. She took the phone. My driver, she started. I'll drive you, he said. She looked at him for a moment, then she nodded. Give me 10 minutes to wrap the meeting. 5, he said. She went back into the conference room. He called Marcus's school, spoke to the front office, arranged for Mrs. Galvin to do the pickup and evening coverage. Mrs. Galvin, who was both reliable and the owner of a complete absence of unnecessary questions, said she'd handle it. He sent her a text with the relevant details and the emergency contact numbers. Then he called Reyes again. Warrant, he said. Judge is reviewing it now, Reyes said. We're looking at maybe 2 more hours. I'm moving my principal to a secondary location, Ethan said. I want the address of Delray's office space swept before we go anywhere. I can send a unit. Now, Reyes, not in 20 minutes. A pause. I'm sending someone now, and I want a direct line to whoever's running the Hartwell surveillance recovery. If they relocate him, I need to know immediately. You'll be the second call, Reyes said. First, Ethan said, you'll be the second. He hung up. He stood in the hallway and ran through the variables. 3 hours was a significant window for someone who was already inside the city and whose behavior pattern had just broken from 8 months of careful distance into active physical presence. People who crossed that line, from remote harassment to showing up, were operating from a different emotional state than the one that had sent measured emails. The photograph had been the first sign. The photograph had communicated something that the emails hadn't. I want you to know I'm watching. That was an escalation of intent, not just method. He thought about what Reyes had said weeks ago. Frustrated people make mistakes. That was true, but frustrated people also sometimes stopped being careful. Victoria came out of the conference room 4 minutes and 30 seconds after she'd gone back in. Ready, she said. He looked at her. She had her bag, her coat, her secondary phone. No laptop. He told her to leave it. Her expression had the quality of someone who was afraid and was not going to let the fear make decisions for her. I have the address, she said. Conroe. My attorney says the alarm code is in the lockbox. Let's go, he said. They went out through the loading dock, which Ethan had identified in week 1 as the exit least likely to be under external observation, and had subsequently made sure was camera-covered and staffed. Salazar met them at the dock, walked with them to Ethan's car in the secured section of the parking structure where staff vehicles were kept, and peeled off once they were moving. Victoria sat in the passenger seat and didn't speak for the first 10 minutes, which he understood was not silence born of fear, but of the controlled processing she did when things required it. He drove, checked his mirrors at the intervals he'd checked mirrors in other cars in other contexts, and let her have the silence. They were on I-45 North, heading toward Conroe when she spoke. "Tell me honestly," she said. "How dangerous is this?" He thought about what honest meant in the specific context. Hartwell has demonstrated a willingness to use intermediaries to get at you. He hired Delray to set up the infrastructure. He hired the robbery suspect through Delray. He's kept himself at a remove from the direct action. He paused. "What concerns me about the last 3 hours is that he's physically present in the city now and unaccounted for. Whether he came here to watch the arrest, because he may know it's coming, or whether he came here for something else is what I don't know. So it depends on which version of him showed up," she said. "Yes. The one who's been methodical for 8 months," she said. "Or the one who sent a photograph?" "Yeah." She looked out the window at the highway, the city thinning into suburbs and the suburbs into the edge of the region. "You think it's the second one?" I think the fact that he flew into Houston himself, instead of using Delray, suggests the methodical phase is over," he said. "That could mean he's coming to watch his plan complete, or it could mean the plan changed to something he felt he had to do himself. And you don't know which." "Not yet." She turned back to the road. "I hate not knowing," she said. "I've spent my whole career building systems so I'd know, so I'd have the information I needed to make good decisions. This is—" She stopped. "This is just waiting." "It is," he said. "I know that's hard for you." She looked at him. "Is it hard for you?" He thought about it. "It's familiar," he said. "I've waited on a lot of things. You get used to the feeling without getting comfortable with it." "What do you do with the part that never gets comfortable?" "Same thing you're doing," he said. "Move through it." She was quiet again, but differently quiet. There was something in the question she'd asked that he understood wasn't really about his methodology. He let it sit. After a while, she said, I'm scared." She said it simply and without prefacing it with, "I don't usually," or "I know I said I wasn't." None of the caveats she usually packaged honesty in. Just the fact. "I know," he said. "I don't mean about Hartwell," she said. "I mean, yes, about him, but that's not—" She stopped again. Outside, the trees had gotten denser along the highway margin. "I'm scared about what happens after. When it's resolved." He kept his eyes on the road. "What do you mean?" She looked at her hands. The ring. "I mean that the last 3 months have been— I've had a reason to let someone in," she said. "A concrete, professional, defensible reason. And when the reason goes away—" She didn't finish the sentence. He drove. He thought about what she was saying and what she wasn't saying and which one he was supposed to respond to. "You think you'll put the walls back up," he said. "I'm very good at it," she said. It was not a boast. It was a plain assessment. "I know," he said. "I don't want to," she said. "I'm telling you that so that when I do it anyway, which I probably will, there's a record of the fact that I didn't want to." She laughed slightly, dry and self-aware. "That's probably the most dysfunctional thing I've said to you." "It's not," he said. "What's worse?" "I once told my team leader, right before a mission where I genuinely didn't expect to come back, that I was worried my son was eating too much sugar," he said. "Because it was the thing I could actually say." He paused. "People do that. They say the adjacent thing when the real thing is too big." She was looking at him. "The adjacent thing you're actually saying," he said, "is that you don't want this to end." A long silence. "No," she said quietly. "I don't." He exhaled. "Me neither," he said. He said it to the road, not to her, because the road was easier to talk to in the specific moment when you were saying a thing that mattered and weren't sure of the ground under it. She didn't say anything for a while. Then, "That's complicated." "Yes," he agreed. "You work for me." "Yes." "There are about 12 reasons that's—" "I'm aware of the 12 reasons," he said. "I've been running through them for 6 weeks. And?" "And they're real reasons," he said. "I'm not dismissing them." He checked the mirror. Clear. They're not the only things that are real." She turned back to the window. The highway had narrowed, and the trees were full dark green in the late afternoon light, and the lake was somewhere ahead of them in the geography, getting closer. I need you to understand something, she said. Okay. I don't do things halfway, she said. If I let something matter, it matters completely. That's not a warning in a romantic sense. It's just, I've only ever done this one way, and I've mostly decided it was easier not to do it at all. I know, he said. I can see that about you. How? He considered it. Because you gave everything to the company, not because you're greedy or driven in the way people assume about CEOs, because it was a safe place to put everything. So it needed all of it, and it gave back proportionally. People are less reliable than that. She looked at him. He could feel it without turning. That's a very accurate thing to say, she said. I pay attention, he said. You do, she said. She stopped. That's actually what started this. Whatever this is. You paid attention to things I didn't expect anyone to notice. He thought about the drawer with the protein bar wrappers, the ring, the morning low-guard conversations, the lunch she skipped, the way she'd looked at the photograph of herself, at the image of someone watched without consent, and the thing that had crossed her face that was about more than security protocols. He thought, I noticed because I was looking. He thought, I was looking because I was already... His phone rang. Reyes. He picked up, and the conversation that followed lasted 4 minutes, and by the end of it, the shape of the next 12 hours was clear. The warrant had come through. Reyes had the signed order. Both targets were in the warrant, Hartwell and Del Rey, and the arrest teams were being positioned as they spoke. And they'd found Hartwell. He was at Del Rey's Galleria office. The unit Reyes had sent to sweep the address had spotted him going in 40 minutes ago, and they'd held position and called it in. He's contained, Reyes said. He doesn't know we're outside. Arrest team is moving in the next 15 minutes. Ethan pulled off the highway onto a surface road, put the car in park, and sat with the phone. Both of them in the building? He said. Confirmed. All right, he breathed out. Call me when it's done. You'll be my first call, Reyes said, which was his way of acknowledging the earlier conversation without making a production of it. He set the phone down. Victoria was watching him. She'd heard enough from his end to understand. They found him, she said. He's at Del Rey's office. Arrest team moving now. She closed her eyes for 1 second, just one. Then she opened them. We keep going to Conroe? She asked. Until I hear the confirmation, he said. Yes. She nodded. He pulled back onto the road. They drove. The call came 47 minutes later, while they were sitting on the porch of the lake house that belonged to Victoria's attorney, with the lake going dark in the early evening and the sound of something moving in the reeds at the water's edge. Reyes. Both in custody. No resistance from Del Rey. He'd come quietly, apparently with the manner of someone who'd expected this was coming and had perhaps been relieved. Hartwell had been more complicated. He'd demanded his attorney, and then his second attorney, and then said several things that Reyes tactfully described as extensive and self-incriminating, which was the best kind of mistake a subject could make. Both in custody. Federal charges pending given the interstate wire communications. The FBI field agent was taking point. It was over. Ethan set the phone down on the arm of the porch chair and looked at the lake. Victoria was in the chair beside him. She was quiet for a moment, and he could feel the thing that moved through her. Not relief exactly, more like the gradual depressurization of something that had been running at elevated pressure for weeks. It's done, he said. Yeah, she said. Her voice was slightly unsteady, not with tears, just with the aftermath of sustained tension releasing all at once, the way a muscle ached when you finally let it relax. They sat with it for a while. The lake settled into its evening sounds. Somewhere behind them the house was dark, and the road was empty, and the nearest neighbor was presumably several hundred yards away behind the trees. I want to ask you something, Victoria said. Okay. When all of this is handled, officially, with HPD and the lawyers and everything settled, would you be willing to have dinner? Not a briefing, not a check-in. She paused. Dinner. He looked at her. She was looking at the lake, not at him, which told him she wasn't sure how he'd answer and was giving him room. Yes, he said. I'd be willing. She turned. That was a fast answer. I've had 6 weeks to think about it, he said. The real smile crossed her face, the short one, the unpolished one. We'd need to manage it carefully, she said. The professional situation, I know, he said. I've thought about that too. I have some ideas, she said, about the reporting structure. There are ways to restructure the position so that there's no direct line between us professionally. It would need board approval, but she caught herself. I'm doing the thing where I turn everything into a project. Is that bad? It's how I feel better about things, she said. When I can solve the logistics, the rest feels manageable. That's not a flaw, he said. That's just your version of paying attention. She looked at him. What's yours? He thought about it. Staying close to the thing I'm trying to protect, he said, until I understand what it needs. The lake made its sounds. The evening was warm and still in the specific way that evenings in Southeast Texas were warm and still, the air itself feeling like something you were moving through rather than breathing. Marcus is going to want to know about this, Victoria said. Marcus is 7, Ethan said. Marcus is 7, and he asked me 4 questions about you on the ride to the office, she said. Specific questions, with follow-ups. What kind of questions? Whether you liked your job, whether you had friends, whether you still missed his mom. She said it carefully. I told him I thought you probably did, and that it was okay to. He was quiet for a moment. What did he say? He said I know she'd want him to be happy. She paused. Then he went back to the crackers. Ethan looked at the lake. The thing that moved through him was the kind that was too specific to name. Not grief, not exactly. More like the awareness of time passing and the things it carried with it and the things it left behind. He's a good kid, he said. He's extraordinary, Victoria said. In the particular way that kids are extraordinary when someone's been paying real attention to them. He understood what she was saying. You'd be taking on something complicated, he said. It wouldn't just be, I know, she said. Ethan. She said his name in a way that stopped him. I picked him up from school and listened to 40 minutes of cracker science, and I have never been less bored in my life. I'm not approaching this without knowing what it is. He looked at her. Okay, he said. Then we figure it out. Together, she said, like she was testing the word. Yeah, he said. Together. Bye. He called Marcus from the porch. Marcus picked up on the second ring, which meant Mrs. Galvin had given him the phone, which meant bedtime was close, and Marcus was executing whatever delaying tactic he'd landed on. Dad, Marcus said, where are you? Work thing ran late, Ethan said. I'm heading back. How was dinner? Mrs. Galvin made soup, Marcus said with the tone of someone reporting a mixed outcome. What kind? The kind without crackers, Marcus said. I asked if we could add crackers, and she said it wasn't the right kind of soup. Dad, there's no wrong kind of soup for crackers. I tend to agree, Ethan said. Is Victoria okay? Marcus asked. Ethan looked at Victoria, who was still looking at the lake with her hands in her lap and her shoulders down from where they'd been for weeks. Yeah, he said. She's okay. Is she coming back? He thought about the right answer and then thought about the fact that Marcus was 7 and had asked the question plainly and deserved a plain answer. I think so, he said. Yeah. Good, Marcus said with complete decision, and then, Dad, can we have crackers in the soup tomorrow? Yes, Ethan said. Go to sleep. Okay? Dad? Yeah. I'm glad you like your job, Marcus said. You sound different. He did not ask different how, because he knew the answer. Go to sleep, he said again, more gently. He hung up. Victoria had heard enough to understand the shape of it, and she didn't ask him to explain it, which was one of the things about her that he'd been noticing for weeks and had been calling professional shorthand and was prepared now to call something more accurate. The lake went on making its sounds. The evening went on being what it was, and the two of them sat on a borrowed porch in a house that wasn't theirs and breathed out for the first time in a long time. And it wasn't perfect. It was uncertain and complicated, and there were 12 real reasons and about 40 logistical questions and a 7-year-old with strong opinions about cracker-to-soup compatibility. But it was real, and it was theirs, and that was enough to start. They drove back to the city at 9 o'clock. Ethan dropped Victoria at her building, where Salazar gave him the all clear, and the building lights burned steady against the Houston dark. Victoria got out of the car and paused at the door and looked back at him through the window. She didn't say anything elaborate. She just said, "Tomorrow morning, lobby." "I'll be there," he said. She went inside. He drove home. Mrs. Galvin was doing a jigsaw puzzle at the kitchen table with the focused concentration of a woman in the middle of something important. She looked up when Ethan came in, registered whatever was in his face, and said simply, "Good night," and saw herself out. He went to Marcus's room. His son was asleep in the wrong direction again, feet toward the pillow, Captain the stuffed dog on the floor beside the bed, rather than in it. He picked Captain up. He fixed the blanket. He stood in the blue light of the nightlight for a moment. He thought about the 72 hours that had become 120. He thought about the lake and the porch and a woman looking at the water with her shoulders finally down. He thought about a robbery outside a hotel on a humid Houston night that had looked like one thing and been another. He thought about how, when you'd spent enough time being the person who stepped between danger and someone else, you forgot to account for what happened to you in the space between. How the act of protecting something required proximity. How proximity required presence. How presence, over time, became something that mattered in ways that weren't on the operational checklist. Marcus shifted in his sleep. Said something that wasn't a word. Settled. Ethan set Captain back against the pillow where he belonged. He turned off the nightlight on the way out. Marcus had been asking to sleep in the dark lately. A new request. Something to do with being in second grade, and second grade being an age where nightlights were apparently reconsidered, and stood in the hallway of the house on Aldine Street with its leaky second bathroom and its kitchen table scarred from the soup experiments and its small square of backyard that needed mowing. He thought, "This is the thing you were protecting all along." He went to bed. For the first time in weeks, he slept straight through until morning. The formal charges against Connor Hartwell were filed on a Wednesday. Ethan read the press release that the U.S. Attorney's Office issued at noon: wire fraud, interstate stalking, conspiracy to commit theft of trade secrets, and a fourth charge related to the coordination of the robbery that the federal prosecutor had constructed with the kind of careful specificity that suggested she'd been waiting for a case like this. Del Rey had taken a plea within 48 hours of his arrest, which Reyes said was the fastest he'd seen anyone cooperate in 15 years on the job, and which provided the evidentiary foundation that made the federal case against Hartwell, in Reyes's words, airtight in a way that doesn't happen very often. Hartwell would contest it. His attorney had already issued a statement that was professionally worded and said nothing of substance, which was the correct move for someone whose client had apparently said enough self-incriminating things in the first 20 minutes of custody to keep a federal prosecutor occupied for months. The legal process would take time. It always did. But the threat was over in every practical sense, and the difference between over and legally concluded was one that Ethan had learned, in other contexts, to accept as the nature of the work. He filed his final threat assessment that Thursday morning. 14 pages. Comprehensive. He wrote the executive summary last, as he always did, and the last paragraph was a single sentence. Based on current law enforcement status and the elimination of active threat vectors, I recommend the return to standard security protocols effective immediately, with quarterly review. He printed it, signed it, and put it on Victoria's desk before she arrived. She came in at 8:15, slightly later than her usual, which he'd noticed as a thing she'd been doing since the night on the porch. Not much later, 10 or 15 minutes, as if she'd given herself small permission to breathe in the mornings rather than arriving at the building like she was racing someone. She read the assessment standing up, which was how she read things she wanted to absorb quickly. He sat in the chair across from her desk and waited. She set it down. Standard protocols. "You don't need the elevated coverage anymore," he said. "Hartwell's in federal custody. Del Rey's cooperating. The infrastructure they built is documented and dismantled. And Salazar? Her contract ends Friday," he said. "She's good. If you ever want to bring her on permanently, I'd recommend her." Victoria sat down behind her desk. She looked at the assessment and then at him. "This feels like it should feel better than it does. How does it feel?" "Strange," she said, Like when you've been carrying something heavy for a long time and you put it down and your arms don't know what to do. He understood that. He'd felt it in different forms, after deployments, after Claire's illness, after the particular sustained tension of the past 3 months. The body had its own memory of what normal was, and when the elevated state ended, normal felt like absence before it felt like relief. That passes, he said. I know. She tapped the edge of the assessment once. I've been thinking about the restructuring. He'd expected this. She'd mentioned it on the porch, and then the following days had been dense with the logistics of the case resolution and the board notification and the company communications, and she hadn't brought it up again, and he'd let her not bring it up. Tell me, he said. The CSO position currently reports to me directly, she said. It's in my org chart under the executive office. I want to change that to a board-level reporting structure. Chief Security Officer reports to the board's risk committee, same as the outside auditors and the general counsel. She looked at him steadily. It's a legitimate restructuring regardless of personal considerations. The board should have direct visibility into security posture at the executive level. I should have written it that way from the beginning. Gerald would agree with that, Ethan said. Gerald already does agree with that, she said. I ran it by him yesterday. You talked to Gerald before you talked to me? I needed a structural opinion from someone who didn't have a stake in the answer, she said. That was prudent. He thought about that for a second. That's fair? I'm going to bring it to the board at the next meeting, she said, which is in 3 weeks. I'd like your formal support for the restructuring in writing. You have it. A pause. After the restructuring is approved, she said carefully, the professional conflict resolves. Yes, he said. It does. She looked at him. 3 weeks. 3 weeks, he agreed. She picked up the assessment again, and he could see she was filing the personal conversation away and returning to the professional one, which was one of the things about her he'd come to understand as not compartmentalization, but as the way she organized her energy. One thing at a time, fully. One more thing, she said without looking up. Okay. There's a science fair Saturday, she said. I was told there would be a cracker display. He looked at her. Who told you? She looked up. Who do you think? He thought about Marcus with her phone number, which he'd apparently obtained at some point and used, which was a conversation Ethan was going to have with his son about appropriateness and timing and the correct channels for social engagement. He called you, Ethan said. He texted, she said. He wanted to make sure I knew the time had changed to 11 instead of 10. She set the assessment down. He also wanted me to know that the display includes a chart, hand-drawn, with a legend. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Victoria. I want to come, she said, without defensiveness or performance. If that's okay with you. He thought about all the things that were supposed to come in a specific order, the restructuring, the board approval, the official resolution of the professional situation. He thought about how systems and timelines and protocols were real and necessary, and also sometimes slower than the thing they were trying to organize. He thought about a 7-year-old who'd texted his employer about a science fair start time. Yeah, he said. That's okay with me. So, the science fair was held in the gymnasium of Marcus's elementary school, which smelled like every elementary school gymnasium Ethan had ever been in. Floor wax and old rubber and the residual energy of approximately 4,000 gym classes, and was decorated with hand-lettered signs and the particular festive chaos of 60-plus children who had spent weeks preparing projects and were now vibrating with the specific frequency of children who needed to tell every adult in the room about their findings. Marcus had requested that his display be positioned near the window, which he explained was because natural light made the cracker comparison chart easier to read. The school had accommodated this with the serene flexibility of teachers who had stopped asking why for certain requests. His display was, objectively, thorough. 3 poster boards, a hand-drawn chart in red and blue marker with a legend that identified each cracker brand by a code name that Marcus had developed independently, brand A, brand B, brand C, because, he explained, he didn't want to be biased by the names. A data table with the raw soak times in both seconds and minutes. A photograph of the experimental setup taken by Ethan on Marcus's tablet that showed 4 bowls of soup lined up with rigorous alignment. And at the top, in the largest letters on the first board, in green marker, Not All Crackers Are the Same, A Study in Structural Integrity by Marcus Cross, age 7. Victoria stood in front of the display for approximately 4 minutes, which was longer than most adults stood in front of any single project, and asked Marcus 3 questions about his methodology, all of which were genuine questions that led to genuine answers that Marcus delivered with the energy of a scientist whose work had finally found its appropriate audience. Your controlled variable, she said, pointing to the chart. You kept the soup temperature consistent. 78 degrees Celsius, Marcus said. Every time. I used a thermometer. He pointed to the equipment list at the bottom of the board. Dad let me use his cooking thermometer. That's rigorous, Victoria said. That's what Dad said, Marcus said. He looked at Ethan with the expression of a child confirming a shared opinion. I told him we both said the same thing, and he said it was because it was correct. He's right, Victoria said. Dad's usually right, Marcus said, with the tone of someone who had arrived at this conclusion empirically. Except about movies. He thinks old movies are better, and they're not. I respectfully disagree with that, Ethan said. What movies does he make you watch? Victoria asked. Old ones, Marcus said, with enormous expressiveness. Black and white ones. Some of them are classics, Ethan said. Dad, they don't have sound effects. They have music. It's not the same, Marcus said to Victoria, as a fellow modern person. Victoria pressed her lips together in the way she pressed them together when she was preventing the short laugh. A teacher came by and asked Marcus to explain his project to a group of visiting parents, and Marcus went, willingly, which was its own kind of milestone, and left Ethan and Victoria standing in front of the cracker boards with the gymnasium noise going around them. He's extraordinary, Victoria said. You said that before. It's still true. She was looking at the display. He figured out on his own that naming the brands would introduce bias. He doesn't know that's what that's called. He just thought about what might make the results unfair and removed it. He thinks carefully, Ethan said. He always has. He paused. Claire was like that. She thought about the mechanics of things. She was a structural engineer before she got sick. Victoria looked at him. It was the first time he'd spoken about Claire in a while, and he could hear the difference in it. Less weight, not because the weight had disappeared, but because he'd learned to carry it differently, the way you learn to carry anything long enough. She would have loved this, he said. Not just the project. The chart with the legend. The code names for the brands. He looked at the display. She would have asked him why he picked letters instead of numbers. What would he have said? Probably something about letters being clearer, Ethan said, or something he'd make up on the spot and then convince himself he'd planned. Victoria smiled. He gets that from someone. Claire, Ethan said immediately. Sure, Victoria said, dry and warm at once. Across the gymnasium, Marcus was explaining the soup temperature protocol to a group of parents with the confidence of someone presenting at a conference. One of the parents, a father, mid-30s, the look of someone who worked in something technical, was nodding with what appeared to be genuine interest and asking follow-up questions. Marcus was handling the follow-ups. Ethan watched this and felt the thing that had no name, the one from Sunday mornings, and this time it sat differently. Not just the awareness of an absence, also the awareness of what was standing beside him, the quiet and the warmth of it, the reality of it, real in the specific way that things were real when you hadn't manufactured them. Thank you for coming, he said. She looked up at him. Thank you for letting me. They stood like that for a moment, in the gymnasium with the floor wax smell and the hand-lettered signs and Marcus holding court across the room, and it was not a romantic moment in any constructed sense. It was a school gymnasium on a Saturday morning, 47 years old in its bones, full of children and noise and the particular democratic cheerfulness of parents who'd drunk coffee too fast. But something settled in it, something that felt like the answer to a question that had been forming for months. He thought, this is what it looks like. The thing I stopped believing was available. He didn't say that. He'd say it eventually, in some form, probably imperfectly, probably at an odd moment. That was how he said the things that mattered, sideways, in the gaps. But he thought it. What's? The board approved the restructuring 3 weeks later on a Tuesday afternoon with the clean efficiency of a decision that had been well prepared and was structurally sound and served multiple legitimate purposes simultaneously. Ethan was not in the boardroom. He was in his office, which was still on the executive floor and would remain on the executive floor because Priya had pointed out correctly that the proximity to decision-making was a feature of the role regardless of reporting structure. And Gerald had agreed, and Victoria had said nothing because she'd constructed the whole thing to be independently defensible, and it was. Gerald stopped by afterward. "Approved," he said from the doorway. "Thank you," Ethan said. Gerald looked at him with the assessment quality he'd had since the first week. "The restructuring is good for the company," he said. "Independently." "I know," Ethan said. "I want to say that clearly," Gerald said, "because I'm aware that it also serves other purposes, and I want you to know that the board approved it because it's the right structure, not as an accommodation." "I understood that going in," Ethan said. "Good." Gerald paused at the door. "She's better," he said. "Since you came. Not softer. She was never the problem. More present." He looked for the word. "She used to manage everything from a slight distance, like she was always keeping 1 foot out of the room." He shrugged. "She's in the room now." He left. Ethan sat with that for a while. He asked her to dinner that Friday. A real dinner, not a briefing, not a crisis, not a meeting that extended past its professional purpose. He picked a restaurant that was not the kind where the menus had no prices, and was not the ride pickup queue outside the Meridian Grand, and was, specifically, a Vietnamese place in Midtown that Marcus had recommended based on a field trip his class had taken past it, which Marcus had described as the one that smells really good. It did smell really good. They sat at a table by the window and they ordered and they talked. And the talking was different from every other version of talking they'd done. Not the morning lobby conversations, not the briefings, not the careful professional exchanges in her office. This was just 2 people having dinner, which sounds simple and is not simple at all. When you've arrived at it through everything, they'd arrived at it through. She talked about the company, not anxiously, not managerially, just with the ease of someone discussing something they'd built and were proud of. She talked about a new client relationship that had developed out of the quarter's work, a family office that had come to her after the Hartwell charges became public and had, counter to what she'd feared, actually increased rather than damaged her firm's reputation. "People are more sophisticated than I sometimes give them credit for," she said. "The ones I work with. They looked at the situation and they saw a woman who'd correctly identified a bad deal, correctly declined, and had the documentation to prove her reasoning. That's what they want managing their money." "That's what they should want," Ethan said. "Yes," she said. "But I was prepared for the opposite response." She turned her water glass in a small circle. "I'm sometimes still prepared for the worst-case version of things." "That's not irrational," he said. "Given your history?" "No," she agreed. "It's protective. It just exhausts you over time, being prepared for the worst." He thought about the version of this he knew from his own experience. The combat instinct that didn't turn off, that cataloged exits in every room and assessed strangers in queues and ran scenarios at 3 a.m. when sleep had decided it wasn't coming. The difference between useful vigilance and vigilance that had become its own cage. "You have to decide at some point what you're protecting against," he said, "and whether the protection is costing you more than what it's protecting." She looked at him. "When did you decide that?" He thought about it honestly. "Slowly," he said. "I don't think there was one moment. Marcus helped. He needed me to be present in a way that made the armor impractical." He paused. "And then things changed. Other things." "Other things," she said. "You," he said, because Sideways wasn't working anymore, and she'd asked a direct question. She was quiet for a moment. You know that's not a small thing to say," she said. "I know. I've been told things like that before," she said, "by people who meant it in the moment, who didn't mean it 6 months later." She said it without self-pity, just as information. "I'm not comparing you to those people. I just want to be honest about what it brings up." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to take it on faith. I'm just saying it because it's true. And I'd rather you have accurate information than comfortable information." She looked at him for a moment. "Accurate information," she said. "It's what you said you wanted," he said. "From the start. You said don't decide what I can handle." I did say that. I'm applying it. She leaned back. The restaurant moved around them, the noise of a Friday dinner crowd, and she looked at him with the expression that was the real one, the unmanaged one, the one he'd been watching appear in increments for months. I have a hard time with this, she said. Specifically this. Someone choosing me without an agenda. I know. I keep looking for what you want, she said, what the angle is. There's no angle, he said. I'm a former Navy SEAL who fixed your camera system and drove you to a lake house in Conroe. The angle was never there. She laughed. The short one, real. When you say it like that, how does it sound? Like someone who's telling the truth, she said, which is either exactly what it is or the best long game in history. It's exactly what it is, he said. She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, Okay, she'd said again, like it was a decision, which it was. I'm going to choose to believe you. Not because I'm naive. You know I'm not naive. But because the alternative is spending the rest of my life managing from a slight distance, and I don't want that anymore. She paused. Gerald said something to me once about the room, about being in the room. What did he say? He said that the best decisions were made by people who were fully in the room, not managing from the doorway. She picked up her fork. I've been in the doorway for a long time. I know, he said. I'm working on the room, she said. He looked at her. You're already in it. She held his eyes for a moment, and then something settled in her expression that he'd never quite seen before, but not relief, not happiness exactly, more like the particular piece of someone who'd been fighting a long time and had finally, deliberately chosen to put the fighting down. Not because the world had gotten safer, because she had. The months that followed were not a montage. They were, specifically, a Tuesday when Victoria got a call from a difficult investor at 7:30 p.m. and sat on Ethan's couch with the phone pressed to her ear and Captain the stuffed dog on her lap because Marcus had installed him there and then fallen asleep on the other couch, and she hadn't moved him. And Ethan brought her tea she didn't ask for, and she mouthed thank you without breaking her professional cadence on the call. And it was entirely ordinary, and also the kind of thing you didn't get unless someone had decided to let you in. They were a Saturday when Marcus wanted to test whether different widths of noodle absorbed broth at different rates, and Victoria sat at the kitchen table with the composition notebook taking notes with the same precise handwriting that appeared in the margins of security assessments. And she and Marcus had a genuine 10-minute disagreement about whether angel hair counted as its own category or was a subcategory of thin noodles. And Ethan made dinner while they argued and didn't intervene because they were both enjoying it. They were a board meeting where Ethan presented the quarterly security report to the risk committee directly, which was the first time he'd addressed the board as something other than a staff member. And the questions they asked were good questions. And the chairwoman said afterward that the report was the most thorough she'd seen from any security function in her 15 years on various boards. And he thanked her and went back to his office and called Victoria to tell her. And she said, I know, Gerald texted me during the meeting. And he said, he texted you during his own board meeting. And she said, Gerald does what Gerald does. And that was the whole conversation. They were a night in November, 3 months after the lake house, when the leaky faucet in the second bathroom finally deteriorated to the point where it required actual attention. And Ethan was under the sink with his phone, flashlight, and tools that he'd owned since before Marcus was born. And Victoria was sitting on the edge of the bathtub, handing him things he asked for, and sometimes the wrong thing when she wasn't paying attention. And Marcus was in the doorway providing commentary. And it was completely undignified and nobody's version of a significant moment, and Ethan thought, this is it. This is what the significant moment looks like from the inside. They were Marcus's birthday in December, which was a complicated month regardless, and Victoria asked, about a week out, whether it was okay if she got him something. Not what should I get him, not a request for a list, just, is it okay? And Ethan said yes, and she got him a proper scientific thermometer, digital, with a probe, the kind that read to decimal places. And Marcus held it with the reverence of someone who'd been given a tool for something real. And the look on his face when he held it was the look of a kid who understood that the person who'd given it had been paying attention to who he actually was. Ethan watched that moment from across the room and felt the accumulation of it, all of it, the months of slow, careful work, the thing that had been built in the margins of danger and briefings and lobby mornings. and he understood something that he hadn't had words for before. The work he'd done his whole adult life, the SEAL teams, the deployments, the combat operations, the protection details, had been about keeping things safe, about putting himself between the threat and the thing worth protecting. He'd been good at it because he'd believed in it. And then Claire got sick, and the thing he most needed to protect was unreachable. And the belief had gotten complicated and hard to hold. What he understood now, watching Victoria hand Marcus a card with the same precise handwriting that appeared in board reports, watching his son read the card with the concentration he gave to things that mattered to him, was this. Protection wasn't a wall. It wasn't a perimeter, or a protocol, or a camera at the right angle. It was a presence. It was being the person who showed up in the lobby and stayed for the cracker experiments and fixed the faucet and made the tea and told you the accurate thing instead of the comfortable thing. He'd been doing the wall version for 3 years since Claire, and it had kept Marcus safe and it had kept himself functional. And it was not wrong exactly. It was just incomplete. The presence version, the one that required you to actually be there, not at a managed distance from the door, was harder. It required something that walls didn't require. It required choosing every day to be reachable. He was choosing it. He was choosing it specifically and imperfectly, and with the full awareness that it would cost him things: comfort, control, the particular safety of living in a smaller space. He was choosing it with a son who had strong opinions about noodle taxonomy and an ex-military thermometer, and a woman who'd spent 20 years learning to fight the world and was slowly, carefully deciding she didn't have to. He was choosing all of it. The following spring, Sterling Capital's security division was recognized by a professional organization as one of the 10 most innovative corporate security programs in the Southwest region. It was a small award given at a conference that Ethan attended briefly and left before the dinner, and the plaque went on the wall of his office beside the window. He'd wanted to be without a window and had stopped minding. Victoria told him, when he got back, that she was proud of it. He said, "It's a regional award." She said, "It's the first thing you've built since you stopped building things." He didn't have a response to that because it was true in the specific way that true things were true when someone had been paying attention to you for long enough. He thought about the legal pad on the first day. Current gaps. Start with the door. He thought about what the door had turned out to be. Not the propped lobby door, though that too. The door he'd needed to start with had been the one he'd kept closed for 3 years. The one that was shaped exactly like the risk of being in the room instead of managing from outside it. He'd gone through it sideways, the way he did most things that mattered, and he was still going through it, which was not a failure of courage, but simply the nature of doors like that. You didn't walk through them once. You chose them every day, with the full knowledge of what they cost and the full knowledge of what you had on the other side. Marcus was 8 now. He had a new experiment, whether different types of rice absorbed water at different rates, which was either the natural evolution of the cracker study or evidence that he had found a calling. He had Captain the stuffed dog, who was showing the wear of significant devotion. He had his father's attention and a digital thermometer, and a woman who showed up to his science fairs and argued with him about noodle taxonomy, and understood without being told that being in this family meant being fully in it. Victoria Sterling, who had built a company from a rented office and secondhand furniture, and $60,000 and a refusal to be managed from a slight distance, was fully in the room. Ethan Cross, who had spent 7 years learning to protect things and 3 years learning to live without the thing that had mattered most, had discovered what he should perhaps have known all along: that the greatest protection wasn't a wall or a protocol or a combat-trained body between the threat and the person. It was the willingness to show up every day. In the lobby, in the gymnasium, under the leaky sink, at the kitchen table with the composition notebook and the wrong things handed over and the tea nobody asked for. To be present and stay present and let the presence be enough. It was, he had decided, more than enough. It was everything. On a Tuesday morning in April, Ethan Cross walked into the lobby of Sterling Capital at 7:30, 2 years to the month since the first day he'd arrived in the suit that belonged to the worst year of his life. Reggie was at the desk. The cameras were correctly angled. The door to the staff corridor was closed, as it had been every morning since the first day, because some habits, once they were right, stayed right. He took the elevator to the executive floor. He sat down at his desk. He opened a fresh legal pad. At the top of the first page, he wrote nothing for a moment. Then he wrote, Q2 security review, start with the perimeter. He uncapped the pen, and outside the window, the city was already in motion, and down the hall he could hear Victoria's voice, the real one, the morning one, slightly faster than the professional version, talking to Derek about something she found absurd based on the pitch of it. And he sat in the office he'd taken on faith on a first day that had turned into everything. He started with the perimeter. He always did.